Case 1, 1992, Irkutsk region. Over a period spanning decades, a police officer entrusted with public safety was quietly linked to a growing number of murdered women. At the time, the deaths appeared unrelated, scattered across isolated roads and rural areas. The suspect lived an ordinary life, held steady employment, and operated inside the very institution responsible for investigating violent crime. Years later, as patterns slowly emerged, suspicion began to form around someone investigators had never seriously questioned before. The attention eventually shifted inward, toward law enforcement itself, raising concerns that the perpetrator had been hiding in plain sight for years. The case formally began with the discovery of multiple female victims found along rural roads throughout the Irkutsk region. The bodies were discovered at different times and locations, often in remote areas with little immediate oversight. Initially, each death was treated as an isolated incident. Some cases were classified as unsolved homicides, while others quietly went cold due to limited evidence and lack of witnesses. As the number of victims increased, authorities began reopening long-ignored files and reviewing older reports. When investigators placed the cases side by side, similarities in location, victim circumstances, and timing became increasingly difficult to dismiss. The emerging pattern suggested the presence of a serial offender operating undetected for years. The victims were primarily women traveling alone at night, often along poorly lit or sparsely populated roads. Many were returning home from social gatherings or traveling between towns where public transportation options were limited. In several cases, evidence indicated the victims had accepted assistance from someone they believed was a police officer. This perceived authority reduced suspicion and resistance. The victims shared no personal connection to one another, which initially complicated efforts to identify a suspect. Their common vulnerability lay in isolation and trust. It would take only years of retrospective analysis for investigators to understand how these circumstances had been systematically exploited. Investigators began re-examining cold cases across the Irkutsk region, focusing on geographic clustering and repeated behavioral elements. Crime scenes were mapped, timelines reconstructed, and forensic materials preserved from earlier investigations were reviewed using updated methods. Gradually, connections emerged linking previously unrelated cases. DNA evidence collected years apart began producing consistent results, pointing toward a single offender. Witness statements were reanalyzed, and vehicle descriptions were compared across incidents. The accumulation of forensic and geographic data narrowed the scope of the investigation. What had once appeared as random violence was now understood as part of a long-running and deliberate pattern. In 2012, the investigation reached a critical turning point. DNA evidence conclusively linked Mikhail Popkov to multiple crime scenes spanning several years. He was arrested and taken into custody without public incident. Following his arrest, investigators expanded their review of unsolved cases, uncovering further connections supported by forensic findings. As evidence mounted, Popkov was formally charged in connection with numerous murders. The scope of the case continued to grow as additional victims were identified and linked through physical evidence. The arrest marked the end of his ability to operate, but only the beginning of a prolonged legal process. Between 2015 and 2023, multiple trials were held to address the full extent of Popkov's crimes. Courts examined evidence connecting him to more than 80 confirmed murders, making the case the largest of its kind in Russian history. He received multiple life sentences, each reflecting additional convictions as new cases were proven. Throughout the proceedings, Popkov remained in custody with no possibility of release. The trials concluded with a documented record of unprecedented scale. Despite the verdicts, investigators acknowledged that the confirmed number might not represent the full extent of his actions. Case 2, 1990s Moscow. In public parks across the city, a quiet man spent hours playing chess with strangers, blending easily into the background of everyday life. He drew little attention and raised no immediate concern. Years later, that ordinary routine became central to a criminal investigation after a missing person report exposed a pattern authorities had failed to see. The suspicion did not arise from a single crime, but from the realization that numerous deaths shared the same geography, the same circumstances, and the same silent figure who had been present all along. The case shifted in a decisive way after the disappearance of a man last seen in the company of Alexander Pichishkin. The report prompted investigators to revisit several deaths that had occurred near a Moscow cemetery over previous years. Many of those deaths had been classified individually, often attributed to alcohol-related incidents or street violence. When reviewed collectively, similarities emerged that had not been apparent before. Victims had last been seen in the same area, often after drinking with an acquaintance. The cemetery grounds appeared repeatedly in reports, suggesting a single operational zone. What once looked random now suggested an intentional pattern. The victims were primarily socially isolated men, many of them older, unemployed, or struggling with addiction. They were individuals whose absences were not immediately noticed and whose deaths did not initially trigger extensive investigations. Pichishkin approached them without force or intimidation, often engaging them in conversation or inviting them to drink together. There were no signs of coercion at the outset. The encounters appeared voluntary and non-threatening, which allowed the offender to gain trust. This consistency in victim selection delayed recognition of the crimes as connected and allowed the killings to continue unnoticed. As police reviewed the cases in detail, forensic evidence and witness accounts began to align. Several witnesses placed Pichishkin in proximity to victims shortly before their deaths. Physical evidence recovered from multiple scenes showed similarities that suggested a single perpetrator. Investigators focused their attention on the area surrounding the cemetery, identifying it as the primary location of activity. Timelines were reconstructed, and movements were compared. The repeated overlap between victims, location, and suspect narrowed the investigation. What emerged was a clear picture of a consistent offender operating within a confined geographic space. The investigation reached its breakthrough during a search of Pichishkin's apartment. Among the items recovered was a chessboard that documented his crimes. Each marking corresponded to a killing, transforming a symbolic object into physical evidence. The chessboard aligned with dates, locations, and victim counts already under investigation. This discovery provided investigators with a direct link between the suspect and the pattern of deaths. The evidence removed remaining uncertainty and confirmed that the crimes were deliberate, planned, and methodically recorded by the offender himself. In 2007, Alexander Pichishkin was convicted of 48 murders and sentenced to life imprisonment. During the trial, the court reviewed forensic findings, witness testimony, and the documented record found in his possession. After sentencing, Pichishkin indicated a willingness to confess to additional killings beyond those proven in court. His statements suggested the confirmed number might not represent the full scope of his crimes. He remains incarcerated, serving a life sentence, while authorities continue to assess unresolved cases potentially linked to his actions. Case 3. 2011, rural Russia. Across several regions, elderly women living alone were found dead inside their homes. At first, the deaths appeared ordinary, the kind that rarely triggered immediate alarm in isolated communities. Many were attributed to natural causes or left unresolved due to limited evidence. Over time, however, the number of similar cases increased. The victims shared age, isolation, and circumstance. Years later, those similarities drew renewed attention, raising the possibility that the deaths were not isolated incidents, but part of a single pattern that had gone unnoticed for far too long. The turning point came as reports of suspicious deaths continued to surface in different jurisdictions. Investigators began receiving notices from neighboring regions describing elderly women found dead under comparable circumstances. Individually, each case seemed unremarkable. Collectively, they raised concern. Law enforcement agencies started reviewing past files, comparing timelines, causes of death, and scene details. What emerged was a troubling repetition. Forced entry was absent, valuables were missing, and there were indications of violence that had previously been overlooked. This growing body of information prompted authorities to formally compare cases across regional boundaries, a step that had not been taken during the early years of the deaths. The victims were elderly women who lived alone, often with limited contact from family or neighbors. Many relied on occasional assistance for household tasks or maintenance. In several cases, evidence suggested the women had willingly opened their doors to a stranger. Investigators later determined that the offender posed as a helper, presenting himself as someone offering assistance rather than a threat. This approach removed suspicion and allowed him to enter homes without resistance. The victims, isolation and trust became central factors in how the crimes were carried out and why they remained undetected for so long. As coordination between regions improved, investigators identified consistent victim profiles and methods of entry. Crime scenes showed similar patterns, and timelines indicated the same offender could have traveled between regions during the relevant periods. Behavioral analysis suggested a methodical approach rather than impulsive violence. Forensic reviews were expanded, and previously collected evidence was re-examined using updated techniques. Gradually, the scope of the investigation narrowed. The consistency across cases supported the conclusion that a single individual was responsible for a large number of deaths spanning several years and locations. In 2020, the accumulated forensic and behavioral evidence converged on Radik Tajarov. He was arrested after investigators established sufficient links between him and multiple crime scenes. The arrest followed years of interregional cooperation and detailed analysis. Once in custody, authorities continued reviewing unresolved cases, strengthening the case against him. The arrest marked the end of the series of killings, but opened a lengthy legal process focused on documenting the full extent of his actions. In 2024, Radik Tajarov was convicted of 31 murders. The court reviewed evidence gathered from multiple regions, including forensic findings and investigative records. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, the maximum penalty available. The verdict closed numerous cases that had remained unresolved for years. The case highlighted the vulnerability of isolated communities and the challenges of detecting serial crimes spread across large geographic areas. Tajarov remains incarcerated, with no indication that his sentence will be reduced or reconsidered. Case 4. 1998 Novosibirsk. Over a period of years, women were murdered across the city while the person responsible remained undetected. The suspect lived an ordinary life, worked within law enforcement, and moved through the urban environment without raising concern. The killings appeared scattered and unrelated, occurring in different locations and at different times. For years, no single offender was identified. The fact that the perpetrator was a police officer placed him beyond early suspicion, allowing the crimes to continue unnoticed within an already complex urban crime landscape. The case began to change when advances in DNA technology made it possible to revisit evidence that had previously produced no results. Biological samples collected from earlier crime scenes were reprocessed using improved forensic methods. Cases that had stalled due to limited evidence were reopened and reviewed. As results were entered into updated databases, matches began to appear between scenes that had once been treated as unrelated. These developments prompted investigators to reassess long-closed files and compare findings across years. What had once been a series of isolated incidents started to resemble a connected sequence of murders. The victims were women living on the social margins of the city. Many had unstable living situations, limited family contact, or lifestyles that delayed missing person reports. Their disappearances did not always generate immediate concern, and in some cases, deaths were discovered long after they occurred. This lack of early reporting reduced investigative momentum and allowed cases to fade. The victims shared no direct personal connections, which further obscured the pattern. Their common vulnerability lay in their isolation and the limited attention their cases initially received. As DNA results accumulated, investigators identified consistent matches linking multiple crime scenes. Murders spanning nearly a decade were connected through forensic evidence, establishing a clear timeline of repeated offenses. Investigators reconstructed movements, compared locations, and aligned dates to confirm that the same individual could have been responsible. The consistency of the DNA findings eliminated alternative explanations. What emerged was a long-running pattern of serial violence that had remained hidden due to technological limitations and the absence of earlier forensic confirmation. In 2016, the investigation reached its breakthrough when DNA evidence conclusively linked Evgeny Chaplinsky to multiple killings. He was arrested and taken into custody following the forensic confirmation. The arrest triggered a comprehensive review of additional unsolved cases to determine the full extent of his involvement. Authorities expanded the scope of the investigation, ensuring that each linked case met evidentiary standards. The forensic links formed the foundation of the prosecution's case and removed uncertainty surrounding the identity of the offender. In 2018, Chaplinsky was convicted of 19 murders. The court examined DNA evidence, investigative records, and the reconstructed timeline of offenses. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, reflecting the scale and duration of his crimes. The verdict closed a series of cases that had remained unresolved for years. Chaplinsky remains incarcerated with no possibility of release. The case underscored the role of forensic science in resolving long-standing investigations and revealed how institutional trust can delay suspicion. Case 5. 2009, Orenburg region. The case came into focus after an arrest led investigators to an unexpected discovery. Among the suspect's belongings was a handwritten diary. Inside, page after page documented acts of violence in deliberate detail. The writing outlined multiple killings, locations, and personal reflections connected to each crime. The diary was not vague or symbolic. It read as a record. At the time of its discovery, authorities were still unaware of the full scale of what it contained. Only later would it become clear that the notebook described a series of murders that had gone largely unnoticed. The investigation began with the discovery of several bodies within a confined geographic area of the Orenburg region. The deaths occurred over time but shared enough similarities to raise concern among local authorities. Initially, each case was handled separately, with limited evidence and few witnesses. As additional bodies were found, investigators began to suspect the presence of a serial offender. The concentration of incidents within the same region suggested repeated activity rather than coincidence. This prompted law enforcement to consolidate case files and begin a broader review of unresolved deaths in the area, shifting the investigation from isolated incidents to a potential pattern. The victims were vulnerable individuals with limited social oversight. Many lived on the margins of society, had unstable routines, or lacked close family connections. Their disappearances did not always result in immediate reports, delaying investigations. This lack of visibility reduced early scrutiny and allowed the crimes to continue without detection. The victims shared no direct relationship with one another, which further complicated efforts to connect the cases. Their vulnerability was a key factor in why the deaths remained unresolved for extended periods, and why the offender was able to operate without early intervention. As the investigation progressed, forensic evidence was collected from multiple scenes and reviewed collectively. These findings were then compared against the contents of the diary recovered from Bychkov. The written entries described locations, actions, and timelines that aligned with physical evidence already in police possession. Together, the forensic material and written confessions formed a comprehensive evidentiary record. The diary did not stand alone. It supported and reinforced the conclusions drawn from crime scene analysis. Investigators were able to reconstruct events with a level of detail rarely available in serial crime cases. In 2012, Alexander Bychkov was arrested. During questioning and evidence review, the diary proved central to the case. Its contents corroborated physical evidence and helped confirm his involvement in multiple killings. Authorities used the diary to validate timelines and identify additional crime scenes. The arrest marked the point at which the investigation transitioned from identifying a suspect to formally documenting the full scope of the crimes. Each entry in the diary was examined against available evidence to ensure accuracy and reliability before being included in the prosecution's case. In 2013, Bychkov was convicted of 9 murders. The court reviewed forensic findings alongside the written material recovered during the investigation. The combined evidence left little doubt regarding his responsibility. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, the maximum penalty available. The verdict closed a case defined not only by the killings themselves, but by the unusual level of documentation left behind. Bychkov remains incarcerated, and the diary remains one of the most significant elements associated with the case, preserved as part of the official record. Case 6. 2010, Moscow region. Over the course of a decade, a pattern of female murders developed quietly across a densely populated area. The cases appeared sporadic, separated by time and location, and no single suspect emerged. Then the sequence ended suddenly, not with a conviction or a trial, but with the death of a suspect while in custody. The abrupt conclusion left investigators without a formal resolution and marked the end of a case that had remained fragmented for years. The shift began when investigators started identifying behavioral links among cases that had long been treated as separate incidents. Individual investigations were reviewed side by side, revealing similarities in circumstances, timing, and methods. These connections had not been apparent during the initial inquiries, which were conducted by different teams at different times. As analysts compared notes, overlapping elements became harder to ignore. The emerging similarities suggested a single offender rather than unrelated acts of violence, prompting a coordinated effort to reassess the cases collectively. The victims ranged widely in age, a factor that complicated profiling and delayed recognition of a pattern. Unlike cases involving a narrowly defined victim group, these murders did not fit a single demographic category. Some victims were young, others elderly, and their daily routines varied significantly. This diversity led investigators to initially pursue multiple theories rather than focus on one suspect. The absence of a consistent victim profile reduced early urgency and allowed the cases to remain disconnected for years, despite underlying similarities in the circumstances of the crimes. As the review continued, geographic and forensic patterns began to emerge. Investigators mapped locations, reconstructed timelines, and re-examined physical evidence using updated methods. Gradually, the data narrowed the field of potential suspects. Behavioral indicators suggested repeated activity by the same individual operating within a defined area. The convergence of geographic proximity and forensic indicators reduced uncertainty and brought focus to a single suspect who matched the emerging profile. In 2020, Andrei Yezhov was arrested after investigators determined there was sufficient evidence to connect him to the series of murders. He was taken into custody as authorities prepared to move forward with formal charges. That process never occurred. While still detained, Yezhov died before prosecutors could present the case in court. His death halted the legal process and prevented a full examination of the evidence in a public trial. The aftermath left the cases legally unresolved. Without a trial or verdict, the murders could not be formally closed through the judicial system. Investigators retained evidence and maintained their conclusions, but the absence of court proceedings meant there was no official determination of guilt. For the families of the victims, the case ended without answers or accountability. The investigation concluded not with resolution, but with uncertainty that remains part of the official record. Case 7. 2010, Irkutsk. A series of violent attacks unsettled the city as residents struggled to understand what was happening in their neighborhoods. The crimes appeared sudden and chaotic, with no immediate explanation. When authorities later identified the perpetrators, the shock deepened. They were not seasoned criminals or adults with long histories of violence. They were teenagers. The revelation altered public perception of the case and reframed the threat investigators were facing, as the violence had come from individuals few believed capable of such acts. The case escalated rapidly after multiple assaults and murders occurred within a short period. Reports came in from the same general area, sometimes separated by only days. Law enforcement responded by increasing patrols and assigning additional resources to the investigation. The frequency of incidents made it clear that immediate action was required. Investigators began treating the crimes as connected rather than isolated, recognizing that the pace of violence posed an ongoing risk to the public. The urgency of the situation pushed the investigation forward at an accelerated rate. The victims were residents of a single neighborhood and appeared to be targeted at random. There was no clear pattern in age, occupation, or personal background. This randomness complicated early profiling efforts and made it difficult to predict where the next attack might occur. The lack of a specific victim type suggested opportunistic violence rather than a targeted motive. Fear spread throughout the area as residents realized that anyone could be at risk, regardless of routine or circumstance. Investigators relied heavily on witness sightings and overlapping crime scene details. Residents reported seeing the same individuals in the vicinity of multiple incidents. Physical evidence from the scenes showed similarities that supported the theory of a single group responsible. Timelines were compared, and movements were reconstructed using available information. These overlaps gradually narrowed the pool of suspects. What began as a wide-ranging inquiry soon focused on two individuals, repeatedly appearing in witness accounts and geographic data. Both teenagers were arrested after investigators established links between them and multiple killings. Evidence connected them to the crime scenes, confirming their involvement in the series of attacks. Once in custody, authorities worked to document the full scope of their actions and ensure each incident was supported by evidence. The arrests ended the immediate threat and brought clarity to a case that had progressed rapidly and unpredictably. During trial proceedings, the court examined the extent of each individual's involvement. Artem Anafriv received a life sentence, reflecting his primary role in the killings. Nikita Litkin received a reduced sentence based on his age and level of participation. The verdicts concluded one of the most disturbing cases in the region's recent history, leaving lasting questions about youth violence and accountability within the criminal justice system. Case 8. 2002, Yekaterinburg. A series of elderly deaths began accumulating quietly across the city, each initially viewed as natural or non-suspicious. The victims were older women, many living alone, and their deaths did not immediately raise concern. Over time, however, the number of similar cases increased. Years later, investigators began linking these deaths to a single woman. The realization challenged long-held assumptions about who could commit serial crimes and forced authorities to reconsider cases that had been closed without deeper scrutiny. The case shifted when repeated robberies were noted following several of the deaths. Investigators observed that valuables were missing from the homes of elderly women who had recently died. At first, the thefts were treated as separate crimes, possibly committed after the deaths. As reports accumulated, similarities became difficult to ignore. The same type of victim, similar property taken, and comparable circumstances appeared again and again. These observations prompted investigators to begin comparing cases that had previously been handled independently, marking the first coordinated effort to determine whether the deaths were connected. The victims were elderly women living alone, often with minimal contact from family, neighbors, or social services. Many had limited mobility and predictable routines, factors that reduced outside attention. Their isolation meant delays in discovery, sometimes allowing days to pass before authorities were notified. This lack of oversight contributed to the initial assumption that the deaths were natural. The victims shared no personal relationships with one another, but their living conditions and vulnerabilities were consistent. These similarities later became central to understanding how the crimes had gone undetected for so long. Investigators began a forensic reanalysis of past cases, reviewing evidence that had been collected years earlier. Improved techniques allowed authorities to reassess cause of death determinations and identify overlooked indicators of violence. As files were reopened and compared, connections emerged linking deaths across different years. Patterns in entry, timing, and post-death theft supported the conclusion that a single offender was responsible. The reanalysis transformed previously isolated incidents into a unified case spanning nearly a decade. In 2010, after sufficient evidence had been consolidated, Gaydama Chuck was arrested. Investigators had assembled forensic findings, behavioral patterns, and case comparisons that supported her involvement in multiple deaths. The arrest followed extensive review and confirmation that each linked case met evidentiary standards. Authorities continued examining additional files after her detention to ensure the full scope of her actions was documented. The arrest marked the end of a prolonged series of crimes that had remained hidden in plain sight. Gaydama Chuck was later convicted of 17 murders. The court reviewed forensic evidence and investigative records demonstrating a consistent pattern of killings followed by robbery. She was sentenced to life imprisonment, reflecting both the number of victims and the sustained nature of the crimes. The verdict closed numerous cases that had long been considered resolved. She remains incarcerated, and the case continues to be cited in discussions about overlooked patterns and assumptions in criminal investigations. Case 9, 2006, Orsk region. Over several years, multiple women vanished along highways and rural roads in southern Russia. The disappearances were separated by time and distance, and no immediate arrests were made. Each case appeared isolated, with few witnesses and limited physical evidence. As time passed, concern grew among investigators and local communities. Despite ongoing inquiries, the women were never found, and the absence of a suspect allowed the case to remain open, unresolved, and increasingly troubling. Investigators began to notice links between the disappearances when timelines and travel routes were compared. Several women were last seen near major highways or transit points, often while traveling alone between towns. The dates of disappearance aligned with periods of increased movement through the region. When mapped together, the cases showed overlap in geographic corridors rather than fixed locations. This analysis suggested the offender was mobile and familiar with long-distance routes. The pattern shifted the investigation from local inquiries to a broader examination of individuals who regularly traveled these roads. The victims were young women traveling alone in remote areas where public transportation was limited. Some were hitchhiking, while others were attempting to reach nearby towns or cities. Their isolation made them vulnerable, and their movements were difficult to track once they disappeared. In many cases, there were no confirmed sightings after initial contact points. The lack of surveillance infrastructure in these areas further complicated efforts to trace their final movements. Their shared vulnerability became a central element in understanding how the disappearances occurred without immediate detection. As the investigation expanded, evidence began pointing toward a long-haul truck driver with access to the relevant routes. Witness accounts, vehicle descriptions, and travel records narrowed the focus to individuals whose work involved frequent movement across the region. Among them, Valery Andreev emerged as a person of interest. His routes overlapped with multiple disappearance locations, and additional circumstantial evidence strengthened suspicion. Investigators worked to build a case that connected his movements with the timelines of the missing women. Andreev was formally identified as a suspect during the investigation. Authorities prepared to move forward with his arrest, but he fled before he could be taken into custody. His disappearance shifted the case from prosecution to manhunt. Despite search efforts and public alerts, he was not located. The failure to apprehend him prevented further questioning and halted progress toward formal charges. His absence left investigators unable to test the evidence in court. Valery Andreev remains a fugitive. No trial has taken place and no verdict has been reached. The cases linked to him remain unresolved, with the women officially classified as missing. Investigators continue to list him as a suspect, but without arrest, the legal process has stalled. The lack of resolution has left families without answers and the case open-ended. As of the most recent reports, Andreev has not been captured, and the investigation remains active but incomplete. Case 10, 1978, Rostov-on-Don. Over a period exceeding a decade, a series of murders unfolded across southern Russia, confounding Soviet authorities. The crimes occurred in different locations and involved victims of varying ages and backgrounds. Early investigations failed to identify a single suspect, and despite growing awareness that a serial offender was active, progress remained limited. The scale and duration of the violence exposed weaknesses in investigative methods and delayed effective intervention, allowing the killings to continue unchecked for years. The case took shape as repeated killings were discovered near transport hubs, including train stations, bus terminals, and surrounding wooded areas. Victims were often last seen traveling alone through these transit points. As bodies were found over time, similarities in location and circumstance became evident. Authorities began to recognize that the murders were connected rather than isolated events. The concentration of incidents near transportation corridors suggested an offender who exploited movement and anonymity, signaling the presence of a serial killer operating across a broad geographic area. The victims included men, women, and children, a range that complicated profiling efforts. Unlike cases with a narrow victim category, this diversity prevented investigators from forming a clear behavioral profile early on. The victims shared vulnerability rather than demographic traits, often traveling alone or becoming separated from others in public spaces. This lack of consistency contributed to investigative uncertainty and delayed recognition of patterns that might have otherwise narrowed the search sooner. The investigation was marked by early missteps, including misidentifications and procedural errors. At one point, an innocent man was detained while the killings continued, further undermining confidence in the process. Limited forensic capabilities restricted the ability to connect evidence across scenes. Over time, however, investigative practices improved. Authorities revisited evidence, refined behavioral analysis, and began incorporating emerging forensic techniques. These advances slowly corrected earlier errors and redirected focus toward identifying the true offender. In 1990, DNA evidence provided the decisive breakthrough. Forensic testing linked Andrei Chikoti to multiple crime scenes, confirming long-held suspicions. He was arrested after being observed engaging in suspicious behavior near a transit area. The DNA match eliminated doubt and allowed authorities to formally connect him to the series of murders. The arrest ended one of the longest-running serial crime investigations in Soviet history. Chikoti was convicted of 52 murders following a highly publicized trial. The court reviewed extensive forensic evidence, investigative records, and reconstructed timelines. In 1994, he was executed, bringing the case to a formal conclusion. The verdict closed a chapter defined by prolonged violence and investigative failure. Chikoti's case remains a reference point in criminal history, illustrating both the consequences of delayed detection and the impact of forensic advancement on complex investigations. Case 1. February 12, 2010, Huntsville, Alabama. A routine faculty meeting at the University of Alabama in Huntsville ended in gunfire after an academic career reached its final collapse. Amy Bishop, a tenure-track professor facing professional rejection, attended the meeting knowing the decision that had defined her future was no longer reversible. The denial of tenure had placed her career under scrutiny and set a fixed-end date on her position. Within the walls of a science building, a professional dispute escalated into lethal violence, transforming an ordinary academic gathering into one of the deadliest workplace shootings in university history. The case began shortly before 4:00 p.m. inside a third-floor conference room at the Shelby Center for Science and Technology. Approximately a dozen faculty members gathered for a routine departmental meeting. Bishop arrived without drawing attention and remained seated for more than half an hour. Without warning, she stood, produced a Ruger P95-9 handgun, and began firing at close range. 3 faculty members were fatally shot, including the department chair. Several others were wounded, including one professor who survived with permanent injuries. When the weapon stopped firing, surviving faculty barricaded the door, believing the shooter might return. Bishop exited the building and was taken into custody outside without resistance. The evidence at the scene did not support any claim of spontaneous confusion or accident. The victims were established academics with long careers in biological research and teaching. They were colleagues who had worked alongside Bishop for years within the same department. Bishop herself was a Harvard-trained neurobiologist who joined the university in 2003 as an assistant professor. Married with 4 children, she appeared professionally successful, but had failed to secure the tenure required to remain at the institution. In March 2009, the university formally denied her tenure application, setting the spring 2010 semester as her final term. She pursued multiple appeals, retained legal counsel, and challenged the decision for months. Each appeal was rejected. By February 2010, her employment was ending, and her academic identity was effectively terminated. It would take only days for the consequences of that decision to fully unfold. Police arrested Bishop outside the building minutes after the shooting. She was transported to jail while investigators processed the crime scene and interviewed survivors. Attention quickly shifted beyond the immediate attack when background checks revealed a prior fatal incident. In 1986, Bishop had shot and killed her younger brother at their family home in Massachusetts. At the time, the death was ruled accidental and no charges were filed. Records showed irregularities in the original investigation, including missing files and unshared evidence. As detectives reviewed Bishop's history, they identified patterns of prior violence that had not resulted in accountability. The focus of the investigation expanded beyond Huntsville, drawing attention to earlier institutional failures. Then, decades-old evidence resurfaced, forcing prosecutors to revisit a case long considered closed. Massachusetts authorities reopened the 1986 killing of Bishop's brother and convened a grand jury. Investigators determined that key information, including an attempted carjacking shortly after the shooting, had never been forwarded to prosecutors. In June 2010, Bishop was formally indicted on first-degree murder charges in Massachusetts, nearly 24 years after the death. Meanwhile, in Alabama, she initially pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity to the university shootings. Legal proceedings unfolded across state lines as prosecutors coordinated charges, evidence, and custody. In 2012, after negotiations and objections from victims, families regarding the death penalty, Bishop changed her plea to guilty. When confronted with the cumulative evidence, her legal strategy shifted, closing the door on a contested trial. On September 24, 2012, Amy Bishop was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the Huntsville killings. The Massachusetts murder charge related to her brother was later dismissed, with prosecutors citing the existing life sentence. She was transferred to a women's correctional facility in Alabama, where she remains incarcerated. Reviews of the case highlighted multiple missed warning signs and procedural failures across institutions and decades. The earlier investigation into her brother's death remained unresolved in terms of accountability. While the legal outcome was final, questions persisted regarding how prior violence had gone unaddressed. To this day, the case remains a reference point in discussions of institutional oversight and delayed justice. Case 2. November 27, 1980, Reno, Nevada. Thanksgiving afternoon brought crowds into the downtown casino district as tourists and families filled the sidewalks along Virginia Street. Stores were open, casinos were busy, and pedestrians moved freely through the holiday atmosphere. Shortly before mid-afternoon, an ordinary shopping corridor became the site of a mass casualty event. What initially appeared to some witnesses as a traffic accident was quickly identified as a deliberate act of violence, turning a public holiday into one of the deadliest days in the city's history. At approximately 2:45 p.m., Priscilla Joyce Ford entered her blue 1974 Lincoln Continental and drove toward the crowded sidewalk near the Reno Hilton and the Nevada Club Casino. Instead of remaining in traffic, she accelerated onto the pedestrian walkway. The vehicle reached an estimated speed of 40 miles per hour as it traveled more than 100 feet along the sidewalk. Pedestrians were struck without warning, several thrown into the air on impact. The vehicle came to rest only after hitting a concrete structure. When the car stopped, multiple victims lay motionless along the pavement. Emergency responders arrived within minutes to a scene marked by bodies, debris, and confusion. 6 people were pronounced dead, and more than 20 others suffered injuries. The damage pattern and eyewitness accounts indicated the act was intentional, not accidental. Ford was 51 years old at the time of the attack. She was a former schoolteacher from Michigan with a documented history of mental illness. Medical records showed diagnoses of paranoid schizophrenia and violent ideation dating back to the early 1970s. She had been treated at multiple psychiatric institutions and released repeatedly. Ford believed she possessed divine identity and authority and had fixated on the removal of her daughter by child welfare authorities years earlier. The separation remained central to her delusions. Prior to arriving in Reno, she had made explicit threats stating that people would die if her daughter was not returned. These statements were reported but did not result in long-term confinement. Her fixation escalated over time, culminating in her return to Reno weeks before Thanksgiving. Ford remained inside her vehicle following the attack and was taken into custody at the scene without resistance. Officers administered a blood alcohol test that later showed a level of .162, more than twice the legal limit. Investigators reviewed her personal history and uncovered a pattern of warnings that had gone unheeded. Prior threats to commit vehicular violence had been documented by law enforcement and federal authorities years earlier. Statements made after her arrest confirmed awareness of the harm caused. Witnesses and officers reported no attempt to flee. The investigation focused on establishing intent, mental competency, and prior notice. Evidence demonstrated that the vehicle was mechanically sound and that steering inputs were deliberate. The case proceeded rapidly toward prosecution as authorities prepared to address both criminal responsibility and mental health claims. Ford's trial began in November 1981 following an extended jury selection process. She entered a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. During proceedings, her statements and testimony reinforced the presence of severe delusional beliefs. Prosecutors presented evidence of prior threats, deliberate acceleration, and post-arrest conduct. The jury rejected the insanity defense, concluding that Ford understood the nature of her actions. In March 1982, she was convicted on 6 counts of murder and multiple counts of attempted murder. The verdict reflected the finding that mental illness did not remove criminal responsibility under state law. Sentencing followed shortly afterward, with the court imposing the death penalty. Ford was transferred to Nevada State Prison, where she spent more than 2 decades on death row. She remained largely compliant during incarceration and accumulated no significant disciplinary record. Her sentence was never carried out. On January 29, 2005, at the age of 75, Priscilla Joyce Ford died from complications related to emphysema. Her death ended the legal process but left unresolved questions about institutional response to repeated warnings. The case remained a reference point in discussions of mental illness, public safety, and the consequences of untreated threats. Case 3. November 11, 2016, Oakland, California. A late-night visit framed as reconciliation ended in a residential neighborhood transformed into a homicide scene. What began as a private meeting between former associates concluded with 3 people dead, a garage fire burning, and a suspect emerging covered in blood. Within hours, the case shifted from an apparent domestic incident into a calculated triple homicide tied to loyalty, control, and long-simmering conflict. Shortly after 12:30 a.m., residents on Dunsmuir Drive reported hearing multiple gunshots. Officers responding to the call found a young man lying in the street outside a single-family home, suffering from a gunshot wound to the torso. He was pronounced dead at the scene. As police secured the area, they noticed smoke and fire coming from the garage of the same residence. While firefighters worked to contain the flames, officers heard movement inside the house. Moments later, Dana Rivers exited the residence. Rivers' clothing was soaked with blood, and officers detected the smell of gasoline. Inside the home, investigators discovered 2 additional victims in a bedroom, both shot and stabbed repeatedly. The scene indicated a sustained and violent attack rather than a spontaneous altercation. The victims were members of the same household. Charlotte Reed was a United States Air Force veteran and small business owner. She lived at the residence with her wife, Patricia Wright, a semi-retired educator, and Wright's 19-year-old son, Benny Diamu Wright, a college student working part-time while pursuing a nursing career. Reed and Rivers had known each other through an all-women motorcycle club known as the Deviants. Rivers had served as an enforcer within the group, a role centered on maintaining discipline and loyalty. When Reed decided to leave the club, tensions developed between the two. Despite the strained history, Reed allowed Rivers to stay at the home that night, believing the conflict had de-escalated. That assumption proved fatal. Investigators recovered extensive physical evidence from the scene. Blood trails connected the interior rooms to the garage, where an attempt had been made to ignite a fire. Multiple weapons were located, including knives and ammunition found on Rivers at the time of arrest. Autopsies confirmed that Reed and Patricia Wright had each been shot twice and stabbed numerous times, while Benny Wright had been shot during an apparent attempt to flee the residence. Rivers was taken into custody immediately and transported for questioning. According to police records, Rivers made spontaneous statements acknowledging involvement in the killings. The crime scene evidence, combined with Rivers' condition at arrest, established a direct link to all 3 deaths. Legal proceedings were delayed for years as courts evaluated Rivers' mental competency to stand trial. Psychological assessments were conducted repeatedly between 2017 and 2022, postponing courtroom proceedings while Rivers remained in custody. Prosecutors argued the acts demonstrated planning and intent, citing the use of multiple weapons, the attempted arson, and the sequence of killings. Rivers entered pleas of not guilty by reason of insanity, asserting diminished responsibility. The court ultimately ruled Rivers competent to stand trial, allowing the case to proceed. Jury selection and testimony finally began in October 2022, nearly 6 years after the killings. On November 15, 2022, the jury returned guilty verdicts on 3 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of arson of an inhabited dwelling. In January 2023, the presiding judge formally rejected the insanity defense, stating the evidence showed deliberation, control, and an effort to conceal the crimes. On June 14, 2023, Dana Rivers was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The court concluded the murders were intentional and premeditated. Rivers remains incarcerated, and the case stands as an example of how personal allegiance and perceived betrayal escalated into fatal violence. Case 4. May 1, 1990, Derry, New Hampshire. A quiet residential condominium became the center of a homicide investigation after what initially appeared to be a burglary gone wrong. The crime scene suggested forced entry and theft, but inconsistencies in the narrative quickly raised concern among investigators. Within days, the focus shifted away from unknown intruders and toward a carefully constructed conspiracy involving manipulation, secrecy, and calculated planning. On the evening of May 1, Gregory Smart returned to his condominium after work. Inside the residence, he was confronted by 2 teenage boys who had entered earlier and waited in silence. He was forced to his knees and shot at close range, dying at the scene. The assailants ransacked the condominium to simulate a robbery before fleeing. Later that night, Pamela Smart arrived home and discovered her husband's body. Police responded to what initially appeared to be a home invasion homicide. However, the absence of forced entry and the selective nature of the stolen items suggested staging. Investigators noted irregularities in the timeline and behavior of the reporting party. The physical evidence did not align with a random burglary, prompting a deeper examination of the circumstances surrounding the killing. Gregory Smart was a 24-year-old insurance salesman with no known enemies. Pamela Smart was 22 years old and worked as a media coordinator at a local high school. She held a college degree and was ribbed as ambitious and professionally driven. During her employment, she began an illicit sexual relationship with a teenage student. The relationship developed into sustained contact and emotional dependency. Over time, Pamela expressed dissatisfaction with her marriage and concern over financial and social consequences of divorce. The student involved believed the relationship was exclusive and permanent. Investigators later determined that Pamela used emotional pressure and threats of abandonment to influence the teenager's actions. The connection between authority, age imbalance, and dependence became central to understanding how the crime unfolded. The investigation advanced when individuals within Pamela Smart's social circle came forward. A teenage intern who worked alongside Pamela reported prior knowledge of the murder plot. Law enforcement obtained recordings in which Pamela discussed the crime after it occurred, including statements suggesting control and intimidation. These recordings provided direct evidence of orchestration rather than coincidence. Police reconstructed communications between Pamela and the teenage perpetrators, establishing planning that occurred weeks before the killing. The focus shifted fully to conspiracy rather than burglary. Investigators documented coordinated actions, rehearsed alibis, and instructions provided in advance. The accumulated evidence contradicted Pamela's initial statements and established her role as the central organizer. Pamela Smart was arrested later in 1990 and charged with conspiracy to commit murder, accomplice to first-degree murder, and witness tampering. Prosecutors structured their case around manipulation and abuse of authority rather than physical presence at the scene. The teenage perpetrators cooperated with authorities in exchange for reduced sentences, providing testimony outlining the planning and pressure applied. The prosecution emphasized the imbalance of power and sustained influence over vulnerable individuals. The strategy focused on intent, orchestration, and coercion rather than direct action. The evidence demonstrated that the crime was executed by others, but directed by Pamela Smart. The trial began in 1991 and received national media attention, becoming one of the first widely televised criminal trials in the United States. The jury heard recorded evidence and testimony detailing the relationship and planning process. Pamela Smart was convicted on all charges and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Her conviction prompted extensive public debate about teacher misconduct and power dynamics. Over the years, she filed multiple petitions for clemency, all of which were denied. The case remained a lasting example of how manipulation, rather than physical force, resulted in a calculated homicide. Case 5. August 20, 1982, Miami, Florida. A routine business disagreement escalated into one of the deadliest workplace attacks in the city's history. A dispute over a small repair bill at an industrial shop ended with multiple fatalities and raised serious questions about ignored warning signs. What unfolded that morning revealed how documented instability, when left unmanaged, could culminate in sudden and irreversible violence. On the morning of August 20, Carl Robert Brown arrived at Bob Moore's Welding and Machine Service on Northwest 36th Street. The previous day, Brown had argued with employees over a $20 charge related to a repair and left the shop visibly angry. During the argument, he made statements indicating he would return and kill everyone, comments that were not reported to authorities. When he returned less than 24 hours later, he was armed with a 12-gauge shotgun purchased earlier that day. Brown entered the shop and began firing methodically at employees in the office, welding area, and machine room. Several workers were struck at close range. By the time the shooting ended, 6 people were dead, 2 were mortally wounded, and others were injured. Brown exited the building calmly after the attack. The victims included shop employees and customers ranging in age from teenagers to elderly workers. Most had no prior connection to Brown beyond being present at the shop. Brown was 51 years old and had worked for years as a history teacher in the Miami area. In the months leading up to the shooting, his behavior had deteriorated significantly. He had been placed on medical leave due to severe anxiety, paranoia, and erratic conduct. Neighbors reported gunfire from his home and increasingly unstable behavior. A psychiatric evaluation conducted earlier in the year documented paranoid ideation and impaired judgment, but concluded he was not a danger to others. Despite repeated concerns from family members and colleagues, no involuntary commitment or law enforcement intervention occurred. Immediately after the shooting, Brown fled the scene on a bicycle. Witnesses reported seeing wounded employees escape into nearby streets seeking help. Civilians in the area, alerted by reports of the massacre, attempted to locate the shooter. Several blocks from the shop, Brown was identified riding his bicycle near Miami International Airport. 2 men confronted him, one armed with a handgun. During the encounter, Brown raised his shotgun. A gunshot struck Brown, and moments later, he was hit by a vehicle during the confrontation. Emergency responders arrived shortly afterward. Brown was pronounced dead at the scene. 20 unused shotgun shells were found in his pockets. Because Brown died during the confrontation, there was no arrest or criminal trial. The investigation instead focused on reconstructing the timeline of events and reviewing Brown's background. Authorities confirmed the weapon purchase, documented the prior business dispute, and reviewed mental health records. Statements from family members revealed that just hours before the shooting, Brown had attempted to involve his young son in violent plans. Efforts by relatives to seek emergency assistance had failed due to jurisdictional confusion. Investigators concluded the shooting was premeditated and that Brown acted alone. In the aftermath, attention turned toward systemic failures. Records showed that Brown's deteriorating condition had been documented by medical professionals, employers, and family members. Despite repeated warnings, no coordinated intervention occurred. The case prompted discussion about mental health evaluations, workplace threat reporting, and the limits of voluntary treatment. Survivors and families of the victims continued to live with the consequences of decisions that went unaddressed. The massacre remained a reference point in debates over institutional responsibility and the cost of ignoring clear warning signs. Case 6. 1972, Florida. A sheriff's deputy patrolled public roads while using the authority of his badge to conceal predatory behavior. At a time when trust in law enforcement remained largely unquestioned, disappearances of young women began to occur across multiple counties. The connection between these crimes and a uniformed officer went unnoticed until survivors exposed conduct that contradicted the role Schieffer had been assigned to uphold. On July 21, 1972, Gerard John Schieffer encountered two teenage girls hitchhiking near Fort Pierce. Using his patrol car and authority, he offered them a ride under the appearance of protection. Instead of transporting them safely, he drove to a secluded wooded area. There, he forced the girls out of the vehicle at gunpoint, bound them to trees, and placed nooses around their necks. Schieffer told them he intended to return later to kill them. A radio call interrupted the assault, requiring his immediate presence elsewhere. He left the girls restrained, stating he would come back. The victims managed to free themselves and reported the incident to authorities. Their escape prevented what investigators later determined would likely have been two additional murders. Schieffer had struggled to maintain professional stability prior to joining law enforcement. He had been dismissed from teaching positions due to inappropriate behavior towards students and warned against holding positions of authority. Despite this history, he was hired by the Martin County Sheriff's Department in June 1972. The badge provided him with access, credibility, and control over vulnerable individuals. His victims were primarily young women who trusted his authority. Schieffer's failures in education, religion, and other careers preceded his law enforcement role, but did not prevent his appointment. The authority he gained enabled his crimes and delayed scrutiny, allowing him to operate without immediate detection. Following the hitchhiking incident, Schieffer was arrested, stripped of his badge, and charged with assault and false imprisonment. He posted bail and was released. 2 months later, two teenage girls, Susan Place and Georgia Jessup, disappeared from Fort Lauderdale. Investigators executed search warrants on Schieffer's residence and his mother's home. Inside, they discovered personal belongings belonging to missing women, including jewelry, clothing, and human remains. Officers also uncovered extensive written material authored by Schieffer, describing abductions, torture, and murder in detail. He claimed the writings were fictional, but investigators determined they aligned closely with real unsolved cases. Schieffer was charged with multiple counts of murder following the discovery of remains on Hutchinson Island. The victims had been bound to trees and strangled using nooses, matching descriptions in his writings. During trial proceedings in 1973, prosecutors presented survivor testimony, physical evidence, and Schieffer's own documents. The jury returned guilty verdicts on 2 counts of first-degree murder. Schieffer received 2 consecutive life sentences. Authorities aided the evidence suggested additional victims, though charges were limited to cases supported by recovered remains. Schieffer remained incarcerated at Florida State Prison, where he continued to boast about his crimes and claimed responsibility for dozens of additional murders. Investigators believed the true number of victims exceeded those proven in court, but many cases remained unresolved. On December 3, 1995, Schieffer was attacked in his cell by another inmate and killed. His death ended the possibility of further prosecutions. Numerous disappearances linked to his movements were never conclusively resolved, leaving families without definitive answers and reinforcing the lasting impact of authority misused. Case 7. July 26, 2025, Arkansas. A summer hiking trail inside Devil's Den State Park became the site of a double homicide that shattered a family outing and triggered a statewide manhunt. What began as a routine walk through a public nature reserve ended with 2 adults dead and their children left alone on the trail. The crime introduced immediate fear into surrounding communities and raised questions about how a suspect had moved unnoticed through multiple institutions before the violence occurred. On the afternoon of July 26, Clinton David Brink, age 43, and Kristen Amanda Brink, age 41, were hiking with their 2 daughters, ages 7 and 9, inside Devil's Den State Park. While on the trail, they encountered a lone man later identified as Andrew James Mann. Without warning, the encounter escalated into a violent attack. Both parents were stabbed repeatedly, sustaining fatal injuries. Witnesses later reported seeing a man emerge from the trail with visible blood on his face and hands before entering a dark-colored vehicle and leaving the area at speed. The Brink children were found alive but alone on the trail by another hiker, physically unharmed but unable to provide details beyond the immediate aftermath. The scene indicated a sudden and deliberate act of violence. The victims were a married couple known for their involvement in their children's lives and outdoor activities. They had no documented conflicts or associations, suggesting targeted risk. Andrew James Mann was 28 years old and worked as an elementary school teacher. His employment history showed movement across multiple school districts in Texas, Oklahoma, and Arkansas. In prior positions, parents had raised concerns regarding boundary issues and inappropriate attention towards students. Each time, Mann was placed on administrative leave or cleared through internal reviews, after which he resigned and relocated. He continued passing background checks and securing new teaching positions. These prior concerns did not result in criminal charges or licensing restrictions, allowing continued access to public spaces and vulnerable populations. Authorities launched an immediate search following the attack. Law enforcement agencies coordinated across county and state lines to identify the suspect and vehicle. Surveillance footage from nearby roadways captured a black Kia Stinger leaving the park vicinity around the time of the killings. Investigators collected blood evidence from the trail and canvassed nearby towns. Public alerts were issued as officers tracked vehicle sightings reported by residents. The search continued for several days as tips narrowed the suspect's movements. The investigation focused on reconstructing Mann's travel route and identifying places he might attempt to blend into normal daily activity. The absence of prior criminal records complicated early identification efforts. On July 30, 2025, 4 days after the killings, officers located Andrew James Mann at a barbershop in Springdale, Arkansas. He was taken into custody without incident while receiving a haircut. Physical examination revealed cuts on his hands consistent with a stabbing attack. DNA testing later confirmed that blood recovered from the crime scene matched Mann. During questioning, investigators reported that Mann made statements acknowledging involvement in the killings. The vehicle linked to the crime was recovered and processed for forensic evidence. The arrest ended the active search and allowed prosecutors to formally proceed with charges. Mann was charged with 2 counts of capital murder. During arraignment proceedings, prosecutors outlined evidence indicating the attack was deliberate rather than random. The case drew national attention due to Mann's employment history and prior warning signs that had not resulted in intervention. Reviews began examining how multiple school districts had addressed complaints and how background check systems failed to identify escalating risk. Mann remained in custody awaiting trial. The case continued to be cited in discussions about institutional oversight, reporting mechanisms, and the consequences of unresolved behavioral warnings. Case 8. January 15, 1989, Greenburgh, New York. A quiet suburban home became the scene of an execution-style killing when a woman was found shot 9 times in the face. The brutality of the attack suggested personal motive rather than random violence. As investigators began reconstructing the victim's final hours, attention shifted toward a private relationship marked by secrecy, fixation, and unresolved obsession. Emergency responders were called to the Solomon residence during the afternoon hours of January 15. Inside, they found 40-year-old Betty Jean Solomon deceased, her body bearing multiple gunshot wounds concentrated to the face and head. There were no signs of forced entry, and the house showed no evidence of a struggle. Betty's husband, Paul Solomon, was not present at the time of the shooting and reported discovering the body upon returning home from work. Initial questioning focused on his whereabouts and routine. While his alibi appeared stable, investigators noted the precision of the attack and the absence of robbery indicators. The manner of death suggested the shooter was familiar with the home and the victim. The case immediately shifted toward identifying someone with access and motive. Betty Solomon was a wife and mother living in an affluent Westchester County community. Her husband worked as an elementary school teacher. Carolyn Warmus was a colleague of Paul Solomon at the same school and was born into significant wealth. She held degrees in psychology and education and had no history of financial instability. Investigators determined that Warmus and Paul Solomon had engaged in an on-and-off extramarital affair lasting more than a year. Evidence showed Warmus became increasingly fixated on Solomon and expressed distress over his refusal to leave his marriage. Witnesses described a pattern in which Warmus pursued emotionally unavailable men. As Solomon attempted to distance himself, the imbalance between expectation and reality intensified. The relationship dynamics became central to understanding motive. The investigation uncovered evidence linking Warmus to the means of the crime. Records showed she had acquired a .25 caliber Beretta handgun through an intermediary. Witnesses placed her in the vicinity of the Solomon residence on the day of the murder. A black glove discovered near the body was believed to belong to Warmus and contained traces consistent with blood evidence. However, questions arose regarding evidence handling and timing. The prosecution relied on circumstantial connections tying Warmus to the weapon, the glove, and the relationship. Defense attorneys challenged the integrity of the investigation and suggested alternative explanations, including evidence manipulation. These disputes became central as the case moved toward trial. Warmus was arrested and charged with second-degree murder and weapons violations. Her first trial began in January 1991, but ended in a hung jury after days of deliberation. Prosecutors chose to retry the case. Prior to the second trial, Paul Solomon reported discovering the previously missing glove inside his home, a development that significantly strengthened the prosecution's argument. The second trial commenced in January 1992. This time, the jury found the evidence sufficient to convict. Warmus was found guilty on all charges. The conviction rested on cumulative circumstantial evidence rather than direct eyewitness testimony. In June 1992, Carolyn Warmus was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. She maintained her innocence throughout incarceration, repeatedly asserting the glove had been planted and that evidence had been mishandled. After serving more than 25 years, she was granted parole in June 2019. Following her release, Warmus continued to seek DNA testing of the glove evidence. The case remained disputed in public discourse, with unresolved questions regarding evidence handling and motive. Case 9. March 24, 2016, St. Louis, Missouri. A young elementary school teacher was found dead inside her apartment, ending a life that had been quietly entangled in secrecy and deception. What initially appeared to be a targeted killing soon revealed a calculated plan rooted in abuse of authority, concealed relationships, and deliberate orchestration. Within days, investigators identified that the crime was not spontaneous, but the result of a murder-for-hire scheme executed with precision. In the early morning hours of March 24, Jocelyn Peters was seated at her kitchen table inside her West Pine Boulevard apartment, working on baby shower invitations. She was several months pregnant. Using a key, the gunman entered without force. Peters was shot once in the head with a .38 caliber firearm, the weapon fitted with a makeshift silencer. She died at the scene. No signs of struggle were present. Later that morning, Cornelius Green arrived and called 911, reporting the discovery of her body. The controlled nature of the crime scene and the absence of robbery indicated a PL and execution rather than random violence. The killing bore the hallmarks of premeditation. Jocelyn Peters was 30 years old and taught second and third grade at an elementary school in St. Louis. She was described as dedicated to her students and deeply invested in her future as a teacher and mother. Cornelius Green was the principal of a nearby middle school and 15 years her senior. He was married and maintained multiple relationships simultaneously. Peters believed Green intended to leave his marriage and build a life with her. Unbeknownst to her, Green had been researching methods to terminate the pregnancy without her knowledge. When those plans failed, investigators later determined he began pursuing permanent solutions to preserve his double life. Detectives traced a series of communications between Green and a longtime associate, Philip Cutler. Phone records showed detailed planning discussions in the weeks before the killing. Financial records revealed Green had stolen approximately $2,500 from a school dance team fundraiser and shipped the cash to Cutler using a parcel service. The package was sent from Green's school address. Surveillance footage and travel records confirmed Green boarded an Amtrak train to Chicago shortly before the murder, leaving behind keys to his apartment, vehicle, and Peters' residence. The timeline demonstrated intentional alibi construction and coordination. Cutler was arrested and questioned shortly after the killing. During interrogation, he confessed to carrying out the shooting and detailed Green's role in planning, funding, and facilitating the crime. He described being provided access to the apartment and receiving confirmation calls before and after the killing. Physical evidence corroborated his account. Investigators recovered purchase records for the firearm and materials used as a silencer. Phone logs placed Green and Cutler in communication immediately after the murder. The confession shifted the case from circumstantial suspicion to direct conspiracy. In February 2024, Cornelius Green pleaded guilty to murder for hire and conspiracy charges in federal court. During sentencing proceedings, prosecutors outlined the extensive planning and betrayal involved. On June 5, 2024, Green was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms with eligibility for parole only after 50 years. He was remanded into federal custody. The case prompted reviews of institutional oversight and misconduct by individuals in positions of authority. The conviction closed the legal process, but left enduring questions about how power and deception enabled the crime. Case 10, 1996-1998, Poughkeepsie, New York. Over a 2-year period, women disappeared from the streets while the man responsible lived openly in a family home, unnoticed by authorities and neighbors alike. The pattern of vanishings went largely unconnected as the city struggled to recognize a serial threat operating in plain sight. Behind closed doors, evidence accumulated silently, concealed within a residence shared by multiple family members. The first confirmed killing occurred on October 24, 1996, when Kendall Francois picked up 30-year-old Wendy Mayers. During their encounter, he strangled her until she lost consciousness and then drowned her in a bathtub. After her death, he He transported her body back to his family home and hid it in the attic. Over the following months, additional murders followed. Each time, Francois returned with the bodies and concealed them within the same residence. The killings occurred without forced entry or disturbance to the household structure. The concealment allowed the crimes to continue undetected as victims were reported missing across the city. Francois targeted women who shared similar characteristics and social vulnerability. Most were sex workers, making their disappearances less likely to trigger immediate, coordinated investigations. At the time of the murders, Francois was employed as a school aide at Arlington Middle School, where he monitored detention halls and interacted daily with students. Colleagues reported inappropriate behavior toward female students, including unwanted physical contact and sexual remarks. Despite complaints, no formal disciplinary action removed him from the position. His employment provided routine, structure, and an appearance of normalcy that deflected suspicion while the killings continued. The investigation progressed slowly as missing persons cases accumulated without a clear link. In early 1998, police interviewed Francois after reports from sex workers described a large man who exhibited violent behavior during encounters. No charges resulted. Later that year, a survivor escaped an assault attempt and identified Francois as her attacker. She reported being strangled and narrowly escaping after convincing him to drive her to a populated area. Her report prompted renewed scrutiny and led detectives to re-examine earlier complaints. During questioning, Francois admitted to killing one of the missing women, providing investigators with their first direct confession. Based on the confession, authorities obtained a search warrant for the Francois family home. On September 2, 1998, investigators entered the residence and discovered multiple bodies hidden in the attic and crawl spaces in various stages of decomposition. The discovery explained months of complaints from neighbors regarding an overwhelming odor emanating from the house. 7 bodies were recovered during the search, with additional evidence confirming an 8th victim. The scale of the concealment shocked investigators and raised questions about how the crimes remained undetected for so long. Francois was indicted on multiple counts of first- and second-degree murder. Prosecutors initially sought the death penalty, but later agreed to a plea deal to avoid trial. In August 2000, Francois was sentenced to 8 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, along with additional concurrent sentences totaling hundreds of years. He was incarcerated at state correctional facilities, where he later died in custody in 2014 from complications related to illness. The case exposed systemic failures in addressing missing persons reports and demonstrated how sustained violence can persist when victims are marginalized and warning signs are ignored.
Case 1. On October 25, 1994, in Union, South Carolina, 23-year-old Susan Smith reported that her car had been stolen by an armed carjacker with her 2 young sons still inside. The emotional mother appeared on television, pleading tearfully for their safe return. But behind the desperate image of a grieving parent, investigators began to notice quiet inconsistencies. Within days, the story of a violent stranger began to unravel, and suspicion shifted toward the woman who had first claimed to be a victim. Susan told police that a black man had forced his way into her car at a red light, ordered her out, and sped away with the children. The shocking claim sparked a massive search across South Carolina. The FBI, local police, and hundreds of volunteers joined in. Roadblocks were set up, lakes were dredged, and national news covered the story for days. Candlelight vigils were held, yellow ribbons tied around trees, and prayers offered across the country. But as the search continued, detectives found small cracks in her story, timelines that didn't match and emotions that seemed strangely measured. Something wasn't adding up. Michael Smith, just 3 years old, and his baby brother Alex, 14 months, were the center of their mother's world, or so it seemed. Susan was trapped in a troubled marriage marked by infidelity and emotional instability. Recently separated from her husband, she was secretly seeing a wealthy man named Tom Findlay. But Findlay had ended the relationship, writing in a letter that he did not want a ready-made family. For Susan, her sons became obstacles to the life she desperately wanted, symbols of the family that stood between her and the man she hoped to marry. It would take only days for her quiet image of a loving mother to collapse completely. Detectives noted contradictions in her accounts. She failed multiple polygraph tests and provided vague, shifting details about the supposed carjacker. Officers searched nearby lakes and discovered tire tracks leading into John D. Long Lake, close to where she claimed the abduction occurred. Investigators also found her demeanor increasingly detached. Then came the turning point, evidence of her relationship with Finlay and the motive it revealed. The romantic rejection, combined with financial pressure, created the profile of a woman capable of desperation and deceit. Then, a single confrontation changed everything. 9 days after her report, Sheriff Howard Wells brought Susan into his office. Calmly, he told her that the evidence no longer supported her story. There was no carjacker, he said. The statement broke through her facade. She began to cry uncontrollably and confessed to a crime that horrified the nation. She had driven her car to John D. Long Lake, placed her sons in the back seat, released the brake, and watched as the vehicle rolled slowly into the dark water. The car sank with both boys strapped into their seats. It was no accident, no moment of panic. It was deliberate. When divers recovered the car from 18 feet of water, the discovery was broadcast live. The image of the submerged vehicle, with the small bodies of Michael and Alex still inside, devastated the nation. Susan Smith was charged with 2 counts of murder. Prosecutors sought the death penalty, describing her as manipulative and cold, while the defense cited years of depression, abuse, and suicide attempts. In July 1995, the jury spared her life, sentencing her instead to life in prison. As of 2025, Susan Smith remains incarcerated at Leith Correctional Institution in South Carolina. Eligible for parole since 2024, she continues to serve her sentence. Her case endures as one of the most infamous examples of maternal filicide in American history. Case 2. On May 19, 1983, Diane Downs arrived at Mackenzie Willamette Hospital in Springfield, Oregon, with a gunshot wound to her forearm. In the back of her car were her 3 children, Cheryl, Christy, and Danny, all critically injured by gunfire. Cheryl, age 7, was already dead. Christy, 8, and Danny, 3, were barely clinging to life. Diane claimed they had been ambushed by a stranger. But as medical staff noted her calm demeanor and lack of urgency, the first suspicions began to form, and they pointed directly at the mother. Diane told investigators that a bushy-haired stranger flagged her down on a rural road, demanded her keys, and opened fire when she refused. But her story lacked detail. Her emotions fluctuated strangely, crying one moment and joking the next. Hospital staff were unsettled by her apparent detachment. Detectives found her account increasingly inconsistent, and her actions after the shooting, driving slowly to the hospital despite the critical condition of her children, fueled further suspicion. Her description of the attacker yielded no suspects. Police were running out of options. Then came a new focus, Diane herself. The children, Cheryl, Christy, and Danny, were from a strained relationship. Diane was engaged in an obsessive affair with a married man named Robert Knickerbocker. Her diaries revealed she viewed her children as obstacles to his affection. The entries described frustration, desire, and a fixation on a future without parental responsibilities. Knickerbocker had made it clear he did not want kids. To Diane, her children became liabilities. She believed that removing them would secure her relationship, even if it meant destroying her own family. But her plan didn't account for survivor. Christy Downs had suffered a massive stroke but survived. She was unable to speak for weeks. Through extensive rehabilitation, her speech slowly returned. District Attorney Fred Hughey formed a bond with the girl and visited regularly. Eventually, Christy answered a question that would change everything. "Who shot you?" Her whispered reply was devastating. "Mom." Her statement provided the missing link. The crime scene evidence, timeline inconsistencies, and Diane's own behavior all aligned. The truth had a voice. Diane Downs had shot her own children. She was arrested and charged with murder and attempted murder. At her trial, she appeared visibly pregnant, a move prosecutors said was designed to gain sympathy. But the jury remained focused. Christy testified, describing how her mother pulled over, retrieved a gun, and opened fire. The chilling testimony was the centerpiece of the case. Diane's bizarre courtroom demeanor, alternating between defiance and smiles, failed to sway the jury. The mountain of evidence, along with her surviving daughter's words, sealed her fate. Diane Downs was convicted and sentenced to life in prison plus 50 years. In 1987, she briefly escaped from the Oregon Women's Correctional Center by scaling a fence. She remained at large for 10 days before being recaptured. Since then, she has consistently maintained her innocence, still blaming the mysterious attacker. Her children, Christy and Danny, were adopted by District Attorney Fred Hughey and his wife and went on to live full lives. As of 2025, Diane Downs remains incarcerated at the Central California Women's Facility. Her case continues to be studied as one of the most disturbing examples of maternal sociopathy. Case 3. On June 20th, 2001, Andrea Yates dialed 911 from her home in Clear Lake, Texas. Her voice was calm, almost attached, as she told the dispatcher, "I killed my children." When police arrived, they found a quiet suburban house turned into a scene of unimaginable horror. 5 young children, all drowned in the family bathtub, lay covered on a bed. It was immediately clear that this was not a moment of rage, but the result of something much deeper and darker. That morning, Andrea's husband, Rusty Yates, had left for work as usual, leaving her alone with their 5 children. Within an hour, she carried out the unthinkable. Methodically, she drowned each of her children, 7-year-old Noah, 5-year-old John, 3-year-old Paul, 2-year-old Luke, and 6-month-old Mary, placing their small bodies on the bed and covering them with a sheet. When her eldest son walked in and saw what had happened, he tried to run. Andrea chased him, caught him, and held him under the water. When she finished, she called the police, then her husband. "It's time," she said simply. The horror was done. The Yates family had appeared to live an ordinary life. Andrea, a former nurse, had left her job to homeschool the children, while Rusty worked as an engineer for NASA. But behind their quiet suburban image was a long history of mental illness. Andrea had suffered from severe postpartum depression after each pregnancy, culminating in full postpartum psychosis after her 4th child. She had been hospitalized multiple times and had attempted suicide. Doctors had warned the couple that another pregnancy could trigger a catastrophic relapse. Still, they had one more child. Her mental state deteriorated rapidly. She became isolated, paranoid, and convinced she was failing as a mother. By June 2001, her delusion centered on religion and eternal damnation. She believed her children were doomed and that killing them was the only way to save their souls. When police arrived, Andrea immediately confessed. She offered no resistance, no attempt to explain or deny what she had done. Investigators discovered her long psychiatric history, diagnoses of major depressive disorder with psychotic features, and the warnings that had gone unheeded. Her journals reflected guilt, despair, and religious fear. She believed Satan was inside her and that her children were being corrupted. The confession, combined with her history, left little doubt about who had committed the crime, but raised a far more complex question. Why? Andrea was charged with capital murder. At her first trial in 2002, prosecutors argued that despite her illness, she knew right from wrong. They claimed her actions, locking the doors, hiding the phone, and calling 911 afterward, proved premeditation. The defense countered that she was legally insane, driven by uncontrollable psychosis. A prosecution psychiatrist testified that Andrea had been inspired by an episode of the TV show Law & Order, in which a woman drowned her children and pleaded insanity. The jury convicted her of capital murder, and she was sentenced to life in prison. Years later, that testimony was proven false. No such episode ever existed. The discovery invalidated the original verdict, and Andrea was granted a retrial in 2006. This time, the defense presented a comprehensive psychiatric profile showing she was completely psychotic at the time of the killings. The jury agreed. Andrea Yates was found not guilty by reason of insanity. She was committed to Kerrville State Hospital, a high-security psychiatric facility in Texas. As of 2025, she remains institutionalized. Each year she has a right to a release hearing, and each year she waives it. Her life now consists of therapy, quiet routines, and artwork. The case of Andrea Yates reshaped national understanding of postpartum psychosis, forcing courts and medical systems to confront the intersection between motherhood, mental illness, and moral responsibility. Case 4. Between 2012 and 2013, a series of sudden family deaths in Springfield, Missouri raised quiet concern, but not enough to trigger an investigation. Diane Stewart's husband died unexpectedly, followed months later by her autistic son. When her daughter Sarah became critically ill, alarm bells finally began to sound. Behind the scenes, Diane had been slowly poisoning her family with antifreeze. Her motive wasn't rage, it was calculation. And her methods were silent, methodical, and fatal. The pattern began on Easter Sunday in 2012, when Diane's husband, Mark Stewart, died unexpectedly. His death was attributed to natural causes, and no autopsy was conducted. Just 5 months later, their 26-year-old son Sean, who was autistic and had previously suffered brain injury, died under similarly vague circumstances. Then, in June 2013, their adult daughter Sarah was hospitalized with multi-organ failure. Her symptoms were severe and unexplained. Doctors were baffled. But someone else finally voiced what no one had yet dared to consider. Something more sinister was happening inside the Stewart home. To Diane, her family members were burdens. Her husband was out of work, her autistic son required constant care, and her daughter Sarah had student loan debt and no job. But her youngest daughter, Rachel, was the exception, a college student and her mother's confidant. Diane spared Rachel from her scheme and instead made her an accomplice. Together, they planned the systematic elimination of their family members. It was a slow process, spiking drinks with ethylene glycol, a chemical found in antifreeze, which is nearly tasteless and lethal in small doses. The breakthrough came not from law enforcement, but from a concerned pastor. He contacted police after overhearing disturbing comments from Diane, joking about the deaths and sounding disturbingly indifferent. Investigators took a closer look. Medical records were reviewed, inconsistencies were found, and patterns began to emerge. When Sarah miraculously survived the poisoning attempt, she became the case's key witness. Combined with toxicology reports and newly discovered evidence, the truth became unavoidable. Diane and Rachel were arrested. During questioning, Diane calmly confessed to poisoning her husband and son. She explained that she had used antifreeze mixed into Gatorade and Coca-Cola. Her reasoning was chilling. She hated her husband and saw Sean as worse than a pest. Rachel, brought in separately, admitted to assisting her mother in planning the murders. She confessed that she knew her father and brother had been poisoned and admitted to helping plan the attempt on Sarah's life. Investigators recovered a diary belonging to Diane filled with disturbing writings, documenting her frustration, hatred, and countdowns to the deaths. Faced with overwhelming evidence, Diane Stewart pleaded guilty to 2 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of first-degree assault. In 2016, she was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Rachel Stewart, who had cooperated with authorities and testified against her mother, received 2 concurrent life sentences with the possibility of parole. Sarah Stewart, the only surviving victim, recovered physically but lives with lifelong damage. As of 2025, Diane remains incarcerated at Chillicothe Correctional Center. The case remains one of Missouri's most haunting family murder cases, an example of calculated maternal betrayal. Case 5. In June 2015, a cryptic and profane message appeared on a shared Facebook account that expletive is dead. Friends and neighbors of Dee Dee and Gypsy Rose Blanchard were horrified. Police arrived at their pink house in Springfield, Missouri, where they discovered Dee Dee's lifeless body, stabbed multiple times. Her daughter, Gypsy, was missing. Fears of an abduction quickly spread. But what they found next unraveled not just a murder, but one of the most disturbing frauds in recent memory. Dee Dee Blanchard had long portrayed herself as a devoted single mother caring for a terminally ill daughter. Gypsy was said to suffer from leukemia, muscular dystrophy, seizures, asthma, and more. She used a wheelchair, feeding tube, and oxygen tank. Their story drew sympathy and donations, free housing, trips, and media attention. But after the murder, police found Gypsy walking unaided and speaking clearly. She was not sick. The abduction was staged. The truth was far more disturbing. Gypsy had spent her entire life under control of a mother who suffered from Munchausen syndrome by proxy. Dee fabricated symptoms, manipulated doctors, and forced unnecessary surgeries upon her daughter. Gypsy had no autonomy, no education, and no access to the outside world. Her appearance was carefully curated to keep the charade alive. For years, she endured physical and emotional abuse, all for the attention and admiration her mother received from their tragic narrative. When investigators brought Gypsy in, she confessed to orchestrating her mother's murder. Surveillance footage showed her and her boyfriend, Nicholas Gojon, buying the murder weapon. Internet searches revealed Gypsy's planning. She had researched medications, death methods, and legal consequences. She described the years of deception and abuse. Dee had kept her drugged, shaved her head, and threatened her into silence. Her only escape had been through secret online relationships. Gojon, emotionally unstable and eager to please, agreed to help. The pair was arrested in Wisconsin days after the killing. Gypsy cooperated fully, providing a detailed account of the abuse and the murder plan. While Gojon physically carried out the stabbing, Gypsy's role in planning it was clear. Prosecutors weighed the complexities of the case. Gypsy was both a co-conspirator and a long-term abuse victim. The emotional and legal nuances made headlines across the country. Nicholas Gojon was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Gypsy Rose Blanchard, in a plea deal acknowledging her years of abuse, was sentenced to 10 years for second-degree murder. Her case drew widespread sympathy. As of 2025, she has been released from prison since December 2023. Now in her 30s, Gypsy is a controversial public figure, both a convicted killer and survivor of prolonged medical torture. Her story remains a cautionary tale about manipulation, captivity, and the blurred line between victim and perpetrator. Case 6. In October 2013, maintenance workers in Lawrenceville, Georgia discovered a steel trash can behind an apartment complex. Inside were the burned remains of a child. Just steps away, police traced the scene to a nearby home. What they found was evidence of prolonged torture, starvation, and an attempted cover-up. The child was 10-year-old Imani Moss. The woman responsible for her death was her stepmother, Tiffany Moss. Imani Moss had been systematically starved by Tiffany over a period of weeks. Locked in a windowless bedroom with no mattress or access to a bathroom, Imani's weight dropped to just 32 pounds, the average for a toddler. While Tiffany's own biological children were fed and cared for, Imani was neglected, isolated, and denied food. After she died of starvation, Tiffany and her husband, a man Moss, tried to destroy her body. They stuffed her remains into a trash can and attempted to incinerate her. Imani was not treated like the other children in the home. Tiffany Moss blamed the girl for a previous child cruelty conviction that had cost her a job as a preschool teacher. That bitterness turned into resentment, then into targeted abuse. Tiffany fed her biological children regular meals while depriving Imani. Investigators later revealed that she even sent photos of those meals to her husband while Imani lay dying in the next room. The investigation quickly exposed the scale of the cruelty. Graphic photos of Imani's emaciated body were recovered. Text messages between Tiffany and her husband documented a disturbing level of detachment. Man Moss eventually agreed to testify against his wife in exchange for a life sentence without parole. He described in detail how Tiffany orchestrated the starvation, ignored Imani's cries, and tried to burn the body to destroy evidence. Tiffany Moss chose to represent herself at trial. She offered no defense. She called no witnesses, made no statements, and did not cross-examine a single person, including her husband. Her silence became the most chilling aspect of the proceedings. Prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence, photographs, testimony, and medical reports. The jury watched as Tiffany sat motionless, showing no emotion or remorse. She did not object to the evidence, nor did she deny the charges. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before finding her guilty on all counts, including malice murder. During sentencing, the prosecution played a recording of Imani begging her father for help. Tiffany again remained silent. On April 30th, 2019, she was sentenced to death by lethal injection. As of 2025, Tiffany Moss is the only woman on Georgia's death row, housed at Arendelle State Prison. Her case stands out not only for the brutality of the crime, but for the chilling indifference that defined her trial. Her silence, in the face of overwhelming guilt, became a defining legacy. Case 7. In June 2020, the search for two missing children ended in horror. J.J. Vallow, age 7, and his sister Tylee Ryan, age 16, had vanished months earlier without a trace. Their mother, Lori Vallow, was on a beach in Hawaii with her new husband, Chad Daybell, smiling for wedding photos while investigators across state lines searched for her children. The disappearance would expose a web of apocalyptic beliefs, lies, and murder that stunned the nation. The children's disappearance began in September 2019 after the family moved from Arizona to Rexburg, Idaho. Lori's explanations to friends and relatives were contradictory. She told some that Tylee was studying at a university, others that JJ was with a family friend. When police arrived to perform a welfare check, Lori and Chad claimed JJ was in Arizona. Days later, they abandoned their home in Tylee. Despite court orders to produce the children, Lori refused. The lies deepened as the story shifted from neglect to outright denial. Behind the smiling exterior, Lori and Chad had built their lives around an extreme fringe theology. Chad Daybell, a self-proclaimed prophet and author of doomsday novels, claimed to see spirits and predict the apocalypse. Lori, once a devoted mother, became his most loyal follower. Together, they came to believe their loved one could become zombies, bodies possessed by dark spirits. They convinced themselves that these dark spirits could only be freed if the physical bodies were destroyed. It was a theology that turned deadly. In June 2020, police, armed with cell phone data from Lori's now-deceased brother, Alex Cox, searched Chad Daybell's backyard in Salem, Idaho. They discovered shallow graves. Tylee's remains were dismembered and burned, found inside a melted bucket. JJ's body was wrapped in plastic and bound with duct tape, buried in a shallow pet grave. The discoveries confirmed what investigators had feared for months. The children had been murdered and hidden on the property of the man their mother had recently married. The couple's apocalyptic language and online writings only deepened the horror. Lori and Chad were arrested in Hawaii earlier that year, long before the bodies were found, after failing to comply with a court order to produce the children. Their carefree behavior, vacationing, laughing, and spending the children's benefits, only added to public outrage. When investigators finally pieced together the digital evidence, it told a damning story. Cell tower data placed Alex Cox at the burial site on the exact days the children disappeared. Combined with Lori's web of lies, the case was complete. In May 2023, Lori Vallow Daybell was convicted of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder for the deaths of her children and for the murder of Chad's previous wife, Tammy Daybell. Prosecutors argued that greed, lust, and delusion fueled the killings. Lori showed no remorse throughout the trial, claiming the children were happy and safe. She was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Chad Daybell awaits trial on similar charges. As of 2025, Lori remains incarcerated at the Pocatello Women's Correctional Center in Idaho, a self-proclaimed prophet-turned-convicted killer. To her followers, she once preached of salvation. In the end, she delivered only death. Case 8. In January 2014, 5-year-old Garnet Spears was rushed to a hospital in Nyack, New York, suffering from severe seizures and dangerously high sodium levels. Doctors fought to save his life as his condition rapidly deteriorated. Meanwhile, his mother, Lacey Spears, posted updates on Facebook, asking for prayers and sharing photos of her unconscious son. But behind the online sympathy was a calculated act of medical abuse. By the time Garnet was declared brain dead, the truth had already begun to unravel. Hospital staff grew suspicious when Garnet's sodium levels spiked without medical explanation. Surveillance cameras were installed in his room. Footage showed Lacey taking him into the private, unmonitored bathroom with his feeding tube supplies, twice, immediately before his condition worsened. The timing was no coincidence. The boy, who appeared fragile and perpetually sick to the public, was being poisoned, and the only person with access to him in those moments was his own mother. Garnet had been a healthy child, but from infancy, Lacey fabricated a wide range of illnesses, claiming he had digestive disorders, seizures, and a compromised immune system. She forced unnecessary medical treatments, including the surgical insertion of a gastric feeding tube. Over time, she used the tube to secretly administer lethal doses of sodium. Lacey documented every hospital visit, every procedure, and every invented symptom on her blog, Garnet's Journey. Her motive wasn't money, it was attention. She craved the sympathy admiration, and identity that came with being the devoted mother of a chronically ill child. Investigators seized Lacey's home medical supplies and found feeding bags heavily contaminated with salt. They uncovered 2 separate feeding tubes, one used publicly, the other privately. Her internet search history included terms like how to make a child sick, salt poisoning symptoms, and sodium levels in children. The police also discovered that the story she told about Garnett's father, claiming he was a heroic police officer who died in a car crash, was completely false. Garnett's real father was alive and had been blocked from contact by Lacey for years. The digital and physical evidence was overwhelming. Lacey was arrested and charged with second-degree murder and first-degree manslaughter. Prosecutors argued that she had slowly tortured and ultimately murdered her son in order to maintain a social media persona. Her trial revealed a disturbing level of premeditation, manipulation, and deceit. Medical experts testified that the sodium levels found in Garnett's body were far beyond anything that could occur naturally or through hospital error. In 2015, Lacey Spears was convicted of second-degree murder. The judge, during sentencing, emphasized the prolonged nature of Garnett's suffering and the chilling documentation of his decline. She was sentenced to 20 years to life in prison. As of 2025, Lacey remains incarcerated at the Bedford Hills Correctional Facility for Women in New York. Her case became a symbol of Munchausen syndrome by proxy in the age of social media, a world where sympathy can be weaponized and where the desire for online validation can turn deadly. Case 9. In June 2008, 2-year-old Kaylee Anthony vanished from her home in Orlando, Florida. For 31 days, her disappearance went unreported. Her mother, 22-year-old Casey Anthony, continued living her life, clubbing, drinking, entering hot body contests, and getting a tattoo on her back that read La Bella Vita, meaning the good life. When questioned by her family, she offered bizarre and evasive explanations. The delay in reporting, combined with Casey's behavior, would soon ignite one of the most controversial criminal cases in American history. The case began to unravel on July 15th, when Casey's mother, Cindy Anthony, finally reported Kaylee missing. She told the 911 operator that Casey's car smelled like a dead body and that her granddaughter hadn't been seen for over a month. Investigators immediately noticed inconsistencies in Casey's story. She claimed a nanny named Zenaida Fernandez Gonzalez had kidnapped Kaylee, but that woman didn't exist. Meanwhile, forensic evidence from Casey's abandoned car pointed toward decomposition. Investigators found a strand of hair, chloroform residue, and signs of human remains. Kaylee had last been seen alive in early June, leaving home with her mother. As the search continued, evidence mounted. Forensic investigators found high levels of chloroform in the trunk of Casey's Pontiac and discovered duct tape residue on a stain believed to be from Kaylee's body. A strand of hair found in the trunk matched Kaylee's DNA and showed characteristics of post-mortem banding, consistent with a dead individual. Investigators also discovered that Casey had searched online for how to make chloroform, neck-breaking, and missing child. Throughout the investigation, Casey lied repeatedly. She took police to a non-existent apartment, claimed to work at Universal Studios, and insisted a fictional nanny was responsible. Detectives soon realized that nearly everything she said was fabricated. Friends and co-workers described her as unbothered by her daughter's absence. She remained cheerful, told no one Kaylee was missing, and continued socializing as if nothing had happened. Her behavior during the investigation shifted the focus from a missing child to the mother herself. Casey was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Her 2011 trial captivated the nation, drawing comparisons to the O.J. Simpson case. The prosecution argued that Casey used chloroform to knock Kaylee unconscious, then suffocated her with duct tape before storing the body in her trunk and later dumping it in a wooded area. They framed her motive as a desire for freedom from parental responsibility. The defense presented a shocking counter-narrative that Kaylee had accidentally drowned in the family pool, and Casey's father, George Anthony, helped cover it up. They also accused George of sexually abusing Casey, claims he denied under oath. On July 5, 2011, the jury acquitted Casey Anthony of murder, manslaughter, and child abuse. She was convicted only of 4 counts of providing false information to law enforcement. The verdict triggered national outrage. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse, television pundits expressed disbelief, and America's most hated mom became a permanent label. Legal analysts debated the strength of the circumstantial evidence, and the case became a landmark example of reasonable doubt in action. Due to time served, Casey was released shortly after the trial. As of 2025, she lives a reclusive life in South Florida. She avoids public appearances and rarely speaks about the case. Kaylee's death remains officially unsolved, with no definitive explanation for her final moments. The trial left behind a legacy of unanswered questions, public fury, and a national conversation about justice, media, and the burden of proof. Case 10. In April 2014, police in Pleasant Grove, Utah, made a discovery that stunned even seasoned investigators. Inside a garage, 7 small cardboard boxes were found stacked among household clutter. Each box contained the remains of an infant, some decomposed, others mummified. The common link was shocking. All 7 had been hidden by the same woman, Megan Huntsman, a mother of 3 who had lived in that house for over a decade. A routine cleanup had uncovered one of Utah's most disturbing murder cases. The case began when Huntsman's estranged husband, Darren West, returned to clean out the garage of their former home. While sorting through boxes, he opened one and found what appeared to be a small, lifeless body wrapping cloth and sealed in a plastic bag. Horrified, he contacted authorities. When police arrived, they searched the property and uncovered 6 more similarly packed boxes. Each contained the remains of a newborn child. The house became a crime scene, and Huntsman became the prime suspect. Megan Huntsman later confessed to killing 6 of her newborns between 1996 and 2006. The 7th, she claimed, was stillborn. During this time, she concealed every pregnancy from her family, friends, and even her husband. Her addiction to methamphetamine, combined with an unstable home life and severe emotional detachment, drove her to end each infant's life moments after birth. She gave birth in secret, suffocated or strangled the babies, then wrapped them and stored their bodies in boxes in the garage. DNA testing confirmed that all 7 infants were fathered by Darren West, her husband at the time. Autopsies revealed that at least 6 of the newborns had been killed deliberately, with evidence of suffocation or strangulation. The murders had occurred over a span of 10 years, all within the same home. Huntsman's ability to hide her pregnancies repeatedly, give birth in isolation, and dispose of the newborns without raising suspicion revealed a level of concealment and compartmentalization that shocked investigators and the public alike. When questioned, Huntsman gave a quiet, emotionless confession. She stated that her motive was simple. She felt unfit to raise more children and was overwhelmed by addiction. She claimed she did not believe she could handle the responsibility and feared further strain on her family. Rather than seek help or consider adoption, she chose to kill each baby and hide the evidence. Her demeanor during questioning showed little remorse, and her explanations were matter-of-fact, disturbing in their lack of emotional depth. In 2015, Megan Huntsman pleaded guilty to 6 counts of first-degree murder. At her sentencing, the judge called her actions incredibly, utterly, horribly cold. She was sentenced to 30 years of life in prison, ensuring she would likely spend the rest of her life behind bars. As of 2025, Huntsman remains incarcerated at the Utah State Prison. Her case is one of the most chilling examples of serial neonaticide in U.S. history, a mother who chose to end the lives of her children at birth and then carried on as if they had never existed.
Case 1. In March 2012, in Coventry, England, a 4-year-old child was reported unresponsive inside his family home. Daniel Pelka had not attended school, and when emergency services arrived, they found a child suffering from extreme malnutrition, extensive bruising, and catastrophic injuries. What initially appeared as a medical emergency quickly raised broader concerns. Investigators began to recognize that Daniel's condition was not the result of a single incident, but the final outcome of prolonged neglect and abuse. Within days, the case drew attention not only to those responsible inside the home, but also to repeated institutional failures that had gone unaddressed for months. The case formally began on March 3, 2012, after Daniel failed to appear at Little Heath Primary School. School staff, already familiar with his frequent absences and concerning physical condition, reported his absence when no explanation was provided. Emergency services were eventually contacted from the family home, where Daniel was found unconscious and unresponsive. Paramedics documented severe emaciation and multiple visible injuries. He was transported to hospital, where medical staff quickly determined that his injuries were incompatible with accidental causes. Despite emergency treatment, Daniel was pronounced dead. Early medical assessments indicated severe head trauma combined with prolonged starvation. The condition of the child immediately contradicted any suggestion of sudden illness or isolated injury. Daniel Pelka was born in July 2007 and moved with his family from Poland to the United Kingdom as a young child. He lived with his mother, Magdalena Luksek, and her partner, Marius Kresolek. The household was known to police and local services due to repeated reports of domestic disturbances. Daniel's father was no longer living in the home. At school, Daniel was described as withdrawn and quiet, with limited English skills that restricted his ability to communicate. Staff observed that he appeared significantly underweight, frequently attempted to obtain food from bins or classmates, and showed little response to pain. These concerns were recorded and discussed, but never escalated to decisive protective action. Outside the home, Daniel's life appeared increasingly isolated, with limited external contact and oversight. Following Daniel's death, West Midlands Police launched a full investigation. Officers reviewed school records, medical histories, and previous police callouts to the address. A search of the home revealed conditions consistent with long-term neglect, including a bare bedroom, evidence of restricted access to food, and signs of prolonged isolation. Forensic examination identified multiple injuries, including at least 10 blows to the head and numerous older wounds in various stages of healing. A post-mortem examination concluded that Daniel died from a severe head injury, with chronic malnutrition significantly weakening his body's ability to survive the trauma. Investigators determined that the abuse had occurred over an extended period, rather than as a single event. Attention quickly focused on Magdalena Luksek and her partner, Marius Kresolek. Both were interviewed and provided accounts that were inconsistent with the medical and forensic findings. Medical experts confirmed that Daniel's starvation and injuries could not be explained by accidents or medical conditions. Evidence showed that food was present in the home but deliberately withheld from the child. Based on this information, both adults were arrested and charged with murder. Prosecutors argued that the sustained abuse, combined with deliberate neglect, directly caused Daniel's death. The investigation also examined how warning signs observed by professionals had failed to trigger effective intervention. In 2013, both defendants were convicted of murder at Coventry Crown Court. Each received a life sentence with a minimum term of 30 years. The trial judge described the cruelty involved as exceptional in its severity. However, neither sentence was fully served. Magdalena Luksek died by suicide in prison in 2015. Marius Kresolek died in custody in 2016. Following the convictions, a serious case review was conducted, examining the actions of schools, healthcare providers, police, and social services. The review concluded that Daniel Pelka had been treated as effectively invisible within the safeguarding system. His death prompted nationwide changes in child protection training and renewed scrutiny of how institutions respond to chronic signs of abuse. Case 2. For nearly 2 decades, Eunice Spry was regarded as a reliable and devoted foster carer in Gloucestershire, England. She presented herself as disciplined, religious, and committed to helping vulnerable children. Authorities repeatedly entrusted children to her care, and no serious concerns were formally sustained against her during that time. Behind closed doors, however, a very different reality existed. The abuse was concealed by isolation, routine, and Spry's cultivated reputation. For years, the children in her care lived under conditions that remained invisible to professionals tasked with protecting them, allowing long-term cruelty to continue without intervention. The case began to unravel in the early 2000s when one of the foster children, no longer living under Spry's control, disclosed abuse to a trusted adult outside the household. That disclosure was reported to police, prompting an investigation into Spry's conduct as a foster carer. As officers began interviewing former foster children, a consistent pattern emerged. The accounts described abuse that was not isolated or short-lived, but systematic and sustained over a period of nearly 20 years. What initially appeared to be a single allegation quickly expanded into a case involving multiple victims and a long history of unchecked cruelty. The foster children placed with Spry came from vulnerable backgrounds and were largely dependent on her for all aspects of daily life. She insisted on homeschooling them, effectively removing teachers, classmates, and mandated reporters from their lives. Contact with extended family and friends was restricted or entirely prevented. Within the home, the children were subjected to rigid control and extreme punishments. These included prolonged forced physical positions, beatings with objects, deprivation, and deliberate humiliation. Without regular access to medical professionals or educators, there were few opportunities for injuries or behavioral changes to be independently assessed. The isolation ensured that concerns, even when present, failed to reach authorities. As the investigation progressed, detectives worked to corroborate the survivor accounts with physical and documentary evidence. Medical records showed injuries consistent with repeated physical abuse. Some victims carried long-term scars and mobility issues that aligned with the punishments they described. Investigators examined the home environment and documented spaces used for confinement and discipline. The consistency between victim testimonies, injury histories, and the physical layout of the home strengthened the case. Authorities concluded that the abuse had been deliberate, organized, and maintained through control and fear rather than spontaneous acts of violence. Eunice Spry was arrested and charged with multiple offenses, including child cruelty, unlawful wounding, and actual bodily harm. During trial proceedings, prosecutors presented testimony from several former foster children, along with medical and forensic evidence supporting their accounts. Spry denied responsibility, portraying her actions as discipline rather than abuse. The court rejected this characterization. She was convicted on numerous counts, with the verdict reflecting the sustained nature of the harm inflicted on the children over many years. The convictions confirmed that the abuse was not accidental or exaggerated, but a prolonged pattern of serious violence and neglect. Spry was sentenced to a lengthy prison term, though she ultimately served a reduced period due to sentence adjustments and release provisions. Following her release, reports indicated that measures were taken to limit public identification, though details remained restricted. In contrast, survivors of the abuse later chose to speak publicly, some documenting their experiences in books and interviews. Their accounts drew attention to weaknesses in foster placement monitoring and long-term oversight. The case prompted renewed examination of how foster carers are assessed, supervised, and reviewed, highlighting how prolonged abuse can persist when isolation and trust replace consistent external scrutiny. Case 3. Jeremiah Valencia did not vanish all at once. He faded from public view over time, removed from school records, unseen by neighbors, and absent from every system designed to notice when a child disappears. By the time questions were finally asked, there was no missing person report, no recent photograph, and no active search. Jeremiah was not found because authorities were looking for him. He was found because his remains were later uncovered in a shallow grave, revealing that his disappearance had been deliberate, prolonged, and fatal. The case came to light in January 2018, while Jeremiah's mother, Tracy Ann Pena, was incarcerated on an unrelated matter. During her detention, she disclosed to another inmate that her teenage son had been killed and buried months earlier. The information was reported to authorities, prompting an immediate investigation by Santa Fe County deputies. Based on the details provided, law enforcement began searching a rural area near Nambe, New Mexico. Within days, officers located a plastic container buried along a remote stretch of land. Inside were the remains of 13-year-old Jeremiah Valencia, confirming that a homicide had been concealed rather than reported. Jeremiah was born in December 2003 and lived with his mother and her partner, Thomas Ferguson. Over time, he was removed from school and cut off from routine contact with teachers, counselors, and mandated reporters. He lived in a rural household where control and violence replaced structure and care. According to later findings, Jeremiah was confined for long periods, denied food, and subjected to repeated assaults. His isolation meant that no welfare checks were conducted, and no external oversight followed his disappearance from school enrollment. What appeared to authorities as an absence was, in reality, a deliberate removal from public systems. Investigators reconstructed Jeremiah's final months using forensic evidence, witness statements, and recovered weapons. Medical examination revealed injuries consistent with prolonged torture rather than a single fatal incident. Authorities documented the use of multiple weapons and restraint methods, indicating sustained abuse over time. Interviews with witnesses and co-defendants supported the conclusion that Jeremiah had been beaten repeatedly while confined inside the home. Evidence also showed that after his death, steps were taken to conceal the crime, including transporting and burying his body in a remote location to avoid detection. Thomas Ferguson, identified as the primary abuser, was arrested but did not face trial. He died by suicide while in custody shortly after his arrest. Ferguson's adult son, Jordan Nunez, was charged for his role in the abuse and for assisting in the disposal of Jeremiah's body. Tracy Pena was also arrested and charged after admitting she was aware of the abuse and failed to intervene or report it. Prosecutors stated that while she did not inflict the fatal injuries, her actions and omissions allowed the abuse to continue unchecked. Jordan Nunez later pleaded guilty and was sentenced to a lengthy prison term for his involvement. Tracy Pena also pleaded guilty to charges including child abuse resulting in death and tampering with evidence, receiving a prison sentence with a portion suspended. The case drew significant criticism of long-term failures in school monitoring and child welfare oversight, particularly how a child could be removed from education for years without follow-up. Jeremiah Valencia's death became a documented example of how isolation and silence can allow extreme abuse to continue until discovery occurs by chance rather than protection. Case 4. In November 2014, a toddler was found critically injured inside an overcrowded mobile home in Pennsylvania. Scott McMillan, 3 years old, had suffered extensive injuries after days of sustained abuse. When first responders arrived, the severity of his condition was immediately apparent. His body showed widespread trauma inconsistent with any single accident. What began as a reported medical emergency quickly revealed a prolonged period of violence inside a home where multiple adults were present, and no one intervened. Emergency services were contacted only after Scott's condition had significantly deteriorated. The call was made hours after the final assault, despite clear signs that the child had been unresponsive for an extended period. Paramedics arriving at the residence observed severe bruising, swelling, and indications of repeated physical harm. Scott was transported to hospital, where medical staff attempted life-saving measures. Despite these efforts, he died from his injuries shortly after arrival. From the outset, investigators noted that the timing of the call and the physical evidence did not align with claims of a sudden or accidental injury. Scott lived in a home occupied by several adults, including his mother and her partner. The environment was described as chaotic and unstable, with ongoing tensions and limited supervision. According to later findings, Scott was subjected to escalating violence over multiple days. His older sibling was also present in the home and exposed to the abuse. Despite the presence of other adults, no meaningful attempt was made to stop the assaults or seek medical help. The child remained dependent on individuals who either participated in or failed to prevent the violence, leaving him without protection as his condition worsened. A post-mortem examination and medical assessments played a central role in the investigation. Doctors concluded that Scott's injuries were the result of repeated assaults rather than a single episode. The pattern of bruising, internal injuries, and trauma indicated prolonged torture. Investigators determined that everyday objects had been used to inflict harm. Medical experts testified that the injuries could not have occurred within a short time frame and would have caused visible distress well before the final collapse, further contradicting explanations offered by those in the home. Scott's mother and her partner were arrested after providing accounts that conflict with the medical evidence and each other. Investigators documented inconsistencies in their timelines and explanations for Scott's condition. Physical evidence recovered from the residence supported findings of extended abuse. As the case progressed, prosecutors argued that both adults bore responsibility, not only for direct actions, but also for their failure to protect a vulnerable child from ongoing harm. The arrests marked the point at which the narrative shifted from negligence to criminal liability. Both defendants ultimately received lengthy prison sentences following their convictions. The court emphasized that Scott's death was preventable and that multiple opportunities existed to intervene before the abuse became fatal. The case reinforced legal precedent regarding failure to protect charges, underscoring that caregivers can be held criminally responsible not only for acts of violence, but also for allowing sustained abuse to continue. Scott McMillan's case became a reference point in discussions about accountability within shared households, where violence against children occurs in plain view. Case 5. In 2007, authorities arrived at a row house in southeast Washington, D.C., expecting to complete routine eviction paperwork. Instead, they were met with conditions that immediately indicated something was wrong. Inside the home, officials discovered 4 children deceased. The bodies were not the result of a recent incident. They had been left undiscovered for months. What began as a standard administrative visit instantly became a homicide investigation, revealing that the children had died in isolation, without intervention from the systems responsible for their care. When U.S. Marshals entered the residence, they found the children's remains in advanced stages of decomposition. The condition of the bodies indicated that they had been dead for an extended period, later estimated to be several months. No emergency calls had been placed, no missing person reports had been filed, and no welfare checks had occurred during that time. The discovery raised immediate questions about how 4 children could die and remain unnoticed in a residential neighborhood, without triggering alarms from schools, medical providers, or social services. The victims were Benita Jenkins's 4 daughters, ranging in age from early childhood to adolescence. Prior to their deaths, the children had been gradually withdrawn from school and medical care. Records showed prolonged absences that were never fully resolved or followed up. Family instability following the death of a partner contributed to increasing isolation within the household. As external contact diminished, the children effectively disappeared from public systems designed to monitor their well-being, leaving no routine oversight to identify escalating risk. Investigators conducted autopsies and reviewed records from multiple agencies, including schools, housing authorities, and child welfare services. Due to the advanced decomposition, precise causes of death for each child could not be conclusively determined. However, evidence of injuries and surrounding circumstances supported homicide determinations. Agency records revealed repeated missed opportunities for intervention. Reports had been filed, visits had been scheduled, and concerns had been raised, but follow-through failed across multiple departments. No single breakdown explained the outcome. Rather, a series of institutional failures allowed the situation to persist undetected. Benita Jenkins was arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder. During pretrial proceedings, questions arose regarding her mental state at the time of the offenses. Despite advice from counsel, Jenkins refused to pursue an insanity defense. Prosecutors argued that, regardless of mental health considerations, her actions and omissions directly led to the deaths of her children. The evidence presented emphasized not only what occurred inside the home, but also the prolonged concealment of the deaths and the absence of any attempt to seek help. Jenkins was convicted and sentenced to 120 years in prison, imposed as consecutive terms for each child. The case triggered widespread scrutiny of Washington, D.C.'s child welfare and housing oversight systems. Multiple employees across agencies were dismissed or disciplined following internal reviews. Policies governing information sharing and welfare checks were revised in response to documented failures. While procedural reforms followed, the case remained a stark example of how systemic gaps can allow extreme neglect and violence to go undetected until discovery occurs by chance rather than protection. Case 6. A severely malnourished teenager was pronounced dead in Oregon after years of documented concerns about abuse and neglect. Jeanette Maples, 15 years old, was found in critical condition inside her family home. Her physical state immediately raised alarms among first responders. She was extremely underweight, weak, and covered in injuries that suggested long-term harm rather than sudden illness. What authorities would later confirm was that Jeanette's death was not an isolated medical crisis, but the final outcome of prolonged deprivation and violence that had been reported, questioned, and repeatedly left unresolved. Emergency responders were summoned not by Jeanette's mother, but after intervention by another family member who recognized the severity of her condition. When paramedics arrived, Jeanette was barely responsive. She was transported for emergency medical care, but efforts to save her failed. She was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. Medical staff immediately noted signs of extreme starvation and abuse. The fact that outside intervention, rather than parental action, triggered the emergency response became a central issue as investigators began examining the timeline leading to her death. Jeanette lived in a household where food, water, and basic care were deliberately restricted. Despite repeated warnings from school officials, extended family members, and community contacts, her living conditions did not improve. Reports described visible weight loss, unexplained injuries, and signs of chronic neglect. Concerns were raised to authorities on multiple occasions, yet Jeanette remained in the same environment. Over time, her world narrowed to the confines of the home, where deprivation became routine and oversight diminished. The warnings existed, but effective intervention never followed. A medical examination provided clear documentation of what Jeanette had endured. The autopsy revealed extensive injuries, both recent and healed, indicating repeated physical harm over a long period. Her body showed signs of prolonged starvation, with little remaining muscle or fat tissue. Medical experts concluded that her weakened condition made survival impossible once the final injuries occurred. Investigators determined that the abuse was not accidental, sporadic, or impulsive. It was sustained, deliberate, and cumulative, ultimately leading to organ failure and death. Jeanette's mother was arrested after investigators reviewed the medical findings and the documented history of abuse reports. Faced with the evidence, she pleaded guilty to aggravated murder. Prosecutors stated that the plea reflected acknowledgement that the prolonged abuse and deprivation directly caused Jeanette's death. The case did not hinge on uncertainty or conflicting accounts. The physical evidence, combined with the long record of warnings, established responsibility beyond dispute. The court sentenced Jeanette's mother to life imprisonment. The case prompted renewed scrutiny of how child welfare agencies assess risk, particularly in situations involving older children who may be perceived as less vulnerable. Reviews conducted after the sentencing emphasized failures in responding decisively to repeated warnings. Jeanette Maples' death became a reference point in policy discussions about escalation thresholds, mandatory follow-ups, and the dangers of assuming that reported abuse will resolve without direct intervention. Case 7. On August 24, 2016, in Albuquerque, New Mexico, a child was killed inside her own apartment on the day she turned 10. Victoria Martins had spent the day celebrating her birthday, with decorations still visible inside the home. By that night, she was dead under circumstances that were immediately unclear and deeply concerning. The setting offered no immediate explanation for how a child could be killed inside a private residence without intervention. What followed exposed a complex chain of events involving multiple adults and a complete breakdown of supervision. Police were dispatched to the apartment after receiving reports of smoke coming from inside the unit. When officers entered, they encountered evidence of extreme violence rather than an accidental fire. The bathroom showed signs of a severe crime, including burning materials and biological evidence. Victoria's body was discovered inside the residence, and emergency responders confirmed she was deceased at the scene. The presence of smoke initially obscured the nature of the incident, but investigators quickly determined that the injuries and scene conditions were inconsistent with an accident. Victoria lived with her mother, Michelle Martins, in an apartment that was frequently occupied by unrelated adults. The household environment was unstable, with individuals moving in and out over short periods of time. Supervision of Victoria was inconsistent, and her exposure to adults outside her immediate family was largely unrestricted. Investigators later determined that the lack of structure and oversight played a critical role in creating conditions where serious harm could occur without immediate detection or interruption. As the investigation progressed, forensic evidence became central to understanding what had happened. DNA analysis and crime scene reconstruction indicated the involvement of more than one individual in the assault and killing. Evidence also pointed to the presence of an unidentified male accomplice who was never publicly named or charged. The findings contradicted early assumptions about who was present and what roles individuals played, forcing investigators to reevaluate the sequence of events inside the apartment. Initial charges reflected early conclusions about responsibility, but those assumptions did not hold as forensic results were reviewed. DNA findings and inconsistencies in statements led prosecutors to revise charges and reframe the case. Some allegations were dismissed or reduced, while others were strengthened based on physical evidence rather than witness accounts. The shifting legal landscape reflected the complexity of proving individual responsibility when multiple adults and incomplete information were involved. Ultimately, the case concluded with a combination of convictions and plea agreements. Some defendants were sentenced to lengthy prison terms, while others accepted responsibility for lesser charges related to abuse and neglect rather than murder. The unidentified accomplice was never brought to trial. The case prompted widespread public outrage and ongoing demands for stronger child safety measures, particularly regarding supervision, background checks, and institutional response when children are placed in unstable living environments. Case 8. In August 2022, an 11-year-old girl died inside a home that, from the outside, appeared stable and respected within its community. Arabella McCormack had lived for years under conditions that were concealed by appearances of normalcy, religious involvement, and public trust. When her death was discovered, authorities quickly determined that it was not the result of sudden illness or accident. Instead, it marked the end of prolonged abuse, that had remained hidden behind a carefully maintained family image. First responders were called to the residence during the early morning hours after reports of a child in medical distress. When deputies and paramedics entered the home, they found Arabella unresponsive and severely malnourished. She was pronounced dead shortly after. Inside the same home, responders also discovered two younger children, Arabella's sisters, who showed clear signs of malnutrition and trauma. The presence of multiple affected children immediately shifted the focus from an isolated medical emergency to a potential pattern of long-term abuse. Arabella and her sisters had been adopted several years earlier and lived under the authority of adults who exercised strict control over nearly every aspect of their lives. The family was active in church and community activities, presenting themselves as devoted caregivers. Behind closed doors, however, the children were subjected to rigid discipline, isolation, and deprivation. Access to food, rest, and basic needs was tightly regulated. The children's limited interaction with outsiders reduced opportunities for independent observation, allowing abuse to persist without detection, despite regular contact with community institutions. As the investigation expanded, prosecutors compiled extensive evidence documenting the scope of the abuse. Medical examinations revealed prolonged starvation and repeated physical harm. Digital records, including messages and logs, supported timelines showing sustained mistreatment over several years. Investigators cataloged hundreds of separate incidents involving punishment, forced exertion, and deprivation. The volume and consistency of the evidence established that the abuse was not sporadic or impulsive, but systematic and ongoing. Based on the findings, multiple members of the household were arrested and charged. Prosecutors alleged that the abuse involved coordinated actions rather than isolated misconduct by a single individual. Evidence showed shared responsibility among adults in enforcing punishments and concealing the children's condition. The arrests marked a significant escalation in the case, shifting it from suspected neglect to allegations of organized cruelty resulting in death. The criminal case remains unresolved, with proceedings ongoing as evidence continues to be reviewed. In parallel, civil litigation has been filed against individuals and institutions accused of failing to intervene despite warning signs. The case has drawn attention to gaps in oversight for adoptive placements and community-based monitoring. Arabella McCormack's death remains under legal examination, with accountability still being determined through both criminal courts and civil actions. Case 9. In August 2023, a child escaped from a residence in southern Utah and exposed abuse occurring inside a household known to millions online. The child, visibly injured and malnourished, sought help from a neighbor, bringing immediate attention to a family previously associated with parenting advice and disciplined family structure. The discovery contradicted the public image that had been carefully maintained for years. What initially appeared to be an isolated emergency quickly became a criminal case involving prolonged abuse hidden behind a widely followed online persona. Police were alerted after a neighbor called emergency services to report a child at their door asking for food and water. Responding officers found the child in a weakened condition, with visible wounds and signs of restraint. Paramedics provided emergency care, while law enforcement secured the scene. Based on the child's condition and statements, officers obtained a warrant to search the residence. Inside, they located another minor in similar physical condition, confirming that the situation involved more than a single incident. The call transformed a private household matter into a multi-agency criminal investigation. The children involved lived under strict control and isolation imposed by their caregivers. They were removed from regular schooling and limited in their contact with others outside the home. Discipline was enforced through deprivation, confinement, and physical punishment. These practices were justified by the adults involved through ideological beliefs centered on obedience and moral correction. The isolation ensured that the children had minimal interaction with mandated reporters, allowing abuse to continue without external challenge despite the family's public visibility. Investigators executed search warrants and documented extensive evidence inside the home. Journals detailed punishments and restrictions imposed on the children over time. Officers recovered restraints and materials consistent with confinement and physical control. Designated spaces within the residence were identified as areas used to isolate children for extended periods. Medical evaluations supported findings of prolonged abuse, including starvation and untreated injuries. The collected evidence established a pattern of deliberate mistreatment rather than spontaneous or disciplinary excess. Ruby Frank and Jody Hildebrandt were arrested and charged with aggravated child abuse. During court proceedings, both defendants entered guilty pleas to multiple counts. Prosecutors presented evidence demonstrating that the abuse was intentional and sustained, supported by written records and physical findings. The pleas eliminated the need for a full trial while formally acknowledging responsibility for the harm inflicted on the children. The case proceeded to the sentencing phase under Utah's indeterminate sentencing framework. Sentencing did not result in a fixed prison term. Under state law, both defendants received consecutive sentences with minimum and maximum ranges determined by statute, leaving the final length of incarceration to be decided by the parole board. The case significantly altered public discourse surrounding online parenting content and the limits of private discipline. It raised questions about accountability, influence, and the role of public platforms in normalizing extreme practices carried out behind closed doors. Case 10. In May 2013, an 8-year-old boy who had repeatedly attempted to report abuse was left without protection. Gabriel Fernandez had made multiple disclosures to adults in positions of authority, describing violence inside his home. Despite these warnings, he remained in the same environment. By the time emergency services were called, the abuse had already reached a fatal point. Gabriel's death became a case defined not only by extreme violence, but by the repeated failure of institutions tasked with responding to his pleas. Emergency responders were dispatched to the family's Palmdale, California, apartment after a call reported a child who was unresponsive. Paramedics arrived to find Gabriel in critical condition, showing extensive injuries and signs of prolonged abuse. He was transported to a hospital, where doctors attempted emergency treatment. Medical staff quickly determined that his injuries were severe and incompatible with survival. Gabriel was later declared brain dead. The condition of his body indicated that the violence had not been recent or isolated, but sustained over an extended period leading up to the final collapse. Gabriel lived with his mother, Pearl Fernandez, and her partner, Isaro Aguirre. Over several months, he was subjected to escalating punishment, including beatings, restraint, deprivation of food, and confinement. During this time, multiple reports were made to law enforcement, child protective services, school officials, and medical professionals. Gabriel himself disclosed abuse to teachers and deputies. Despite these reports, he was repeatedly returned to the same household. The documented warnings formed a clear pattern of concern that did not result in effective removal or protection. The investigation following Gabriel's death relied heavily on medical and documentary evidence. An autopsy revealed extensive internal and external injuries, including fractures, burns, and signs of long-term starvation. The findings confirmed sustained torture rather than accidental harm. Investigators reviewed child welfare records and law enforcement reports, uncovering a history of missed follow-ups, downgraded risk assessments, and unverified home checks. The documentation showed that multiple agencies had contact with Gabriel in the months before his death, yet no coordinated action occurred. Pearl Fernandez and Isaro Aguirre were arrested and charged with murder under special circumstances, including torture. Prosecutors presented evidence demonstrating that the abuse was intentional, prolonged, and directly responsible for Gabriel's death. Fernandez later entered a guilty plea, while Aguirre proceeded to trial. The charges reflected not only the fatal outcome, but the severity and duration of the abuse inflicted on a child who had repeatedly sought help. Fernandez was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Aguirre was convicted and sentenced to death. The case prompted widespread public outrage and national scrutiny of child protective services, law enforcement response, and interagency communication. Reviews were conducted into how repeated reports failed to produce decisive intervention. Gabriel Fernandez's case became a focal point in discussions about systemic accountability and the consequences of ignoring documented warnings when a child reports abuse. Case 1, 1989 to 1990. Along the highways of central and southern Florida, men who picked up hitchhikers or sought sex workers began to disappear. Their bodies later surfaced in wooded areas, dumped near roads, or hidden far from towns. Each victim had been shot at close range. Investigators soon noticed that the crimes followed a consistent pattern tied to roadside encounters. Within weeks, attention shifted away from random violence and toward a single female drifter who had been seen traveling with the victims shortly before their deaths. The case first emerged on December 1, 1989, when the body of Richard Mallory was discovered in a remote area of Volusia County, Florida. He had been shot multiple times, and his vehicle was missing. Witnesses later confirmed he had been last seen with a woman along the highway. In the following months, additional men were found dead under similar circumstances across several counties. Each victim had suffered gunshot wounds, and their cars were later located abandoned or sold. While early reports suggested robbery, the growing number of cases raised concerns of a serial offender. The evidence at the scenes did not match a spontaneous crime. The victims shared notable similarities. They were adult men, most middle-aged, many of whom had encountered a woman offering sex or companionship along Florida highways. Several victims had personal vehicles that were later stolen and resold. Their daily routines placed them in isolated locations, making them vulnerable to attack. Investigators confirmed that the victims had no connection to one another beyond their encounters with the same woman. The suspect was identified as Aileen Wuornos, a drifter who relied on roadside solicitation for survival. It would take only days for her transient lifestyle to unravel under scrutiny. Law enforcement agencies began coordinating across county lines to track the suspect's movements. Ballistics testing revealed that the same firearm had been used in multiple killings. Pawn shop records and vehicle recovery reports showed that the victims' belongings were sold shortly after their deaths. Witnesses placed Wuornos in possession of the victims' cars. Surveillance and financial records established a timeline linking her to each crime location. The evidence steadily narrowed the investigation toward a single suspect. Then, recorded communications revealed admissions that aligned with the physical evidence already collected. In January 1991, authorities arrested Aileen Wuornos in Volusia County. A search uncovered the firearm used in the murders, along with personal items belonging to the victims. Investigators obtained recorded phone calls between Wuornos and her partner, during which she admitted responsibility for the killings. These recordings corroborated forensic findings and witness statements. Prosecutors later confirmed that the pattern of theft and weapon use was consistent across all cases. When confronted with the accumulated evidence, Wuornos provided statements that directly linked her to multiple homicides. Between 1992 and 1993, Wuornos was convicted of 6 murders and received multiple death sentences. She claimed the killings were acts of self-defense, alleging attempted sexual assaults by the victims. Courts rejected these claims, citing the consistent pattern of robbery and execution-style shootings. She was executed by lethal injection on October 9, 2002. Her case continued to generate debate regarding culpability, mental health, and motive. To this day, investigators and analysts remain divided over how much of the violence stemmed from survival claims versus calculated intent. Case 2. Between 1974 and 1978, across several U.S. states, young women began disappearing under similar circumstances. Many were last seen near college campuses after interacting with a polite, well-spoken man who appeared injured. He often wore a cast or used crutches, presenting himself as harmless and in need of assistance. Witnesses later recalled how easily he gained trust. As missing persons reports increased, investigators began to suspect that these disappearances were connected. Within a short period, attention shifted toward a single individual whose movements overlapped multiple crime scenes. The pattern first became apparent in early 1974 near the University of Washington in Seattle. Several female students vanished after being approached in public areas during daylight hours. Survivors later described a man who asked for help carrying books or loading items into a car. Once isolated, the victims were attacked. Bodies were later discovered in wooded or remote areas, often showing signs of blunt force trauma and restraint. The repeated use of the same approach established a clear method. Although early investigations treated the cases as isolated incidents, the growing number of disappearances forced authorities to reconsider. The evidence at each scene suggested planning rather than chance. TA. Victims were predominantly college-aged women who shared similar routines involving campuses, libraries, and public transit areas. Many were described as cautious and independent, yet they responded to what appeared to be a genuine request for help. The suspect exploited social norms of trust and politeness. Several victims had no known connection to one another beyond their encounters with the same man. Their disappearances disrupted families and campuses across multiple states. As reports accumulated, investigators recognized that the offender selected victims deliberately based on accessibility and vulnerability. It would take only a few survivor accounts to expose the method behind the attacks. Law enforcement agencies began comparing witness statements from different jurisdictions. Several women reported encounters with a man named Ted, who drove a tan Volkswagen Beetle. One survivor provided detailed descriptions after escaping an attempted abduction, offering critical insight into the suspect's behavior. Police identified similar vehicles near multiple abduction sites. Physical evidence recovered from crime scenes aligned with survivor testimony. As tips poured in, investigators focused their attention on Ted Bundy, a law student whose appearance and movements matched numerous reports. The case shifted rapidly as connections became impossible to ignore. In August 1975, Bundy was arrested in Utah after attempting to abduct a woman from a public location. A search of his vehicle revealed handcuffs, rope, masks, and other items consistent with earlier attacks. Although he was released on bail, authorities continued building cases against him. Additional evidence, including bite mark analysis and eyewitness testimony, strengthened the prosecutions. Bundy was later arrested again and faced multiple charges across several states. When confronted with the cumulative evidence, the case against him expanded from suspicion to confirmed responsibility for numerous murders. Bundy was convicted in multiple trials and received death sentences for murders committed in Florida. His trials attracted national attention and influenced public understanding of serial offenders. Despite appeals and delays, he was executed by electric chair on January 24, 1989. The case left a lasting impact on criminal investigations, particularly in the use of behavioral profiling and interagency cooperation. While Bundy's charm and intelligence complicated early detection, the evidence ultimately exposed a calculated pattern of violence. His crimes continue to be studied as examples of manipulation, escalation, and systemic investigative failure. Case 3. In July 1991, Milwaukee police responded to what initially appeared to be a routine call involving a disturbance on a city street. Officers were directed to a nearby apartment building, unaware that the address was connected to years of hidden violence. Inside that residence lived Jeffrey Dahmer, a quiet man who had largely escaped attention. What officers encountered would soon be described as one of the most disturbing crime scenes in United States history, exposing crimes that had gone undetected for over a decade. The case began on July 22, 1991, when Tracy Edwards escaped from Dahmer's apartment and flagged down police. Edwards reported that he had been restrained and threatened inside the residence. Officers returned with him to the apartment to investigate. Upon entering, they noticed an overwhelming odor. While conducting a search, officers discovered Polaroid photographs depicting dismembered bodies. These images immediately shifted the situation from a routine inquiry to a criminal investigation. Further inspection revealed items inconsistent with any lawful explanation. The evidence at the scene directly contradicted Dahmer's initial statements. Dahmer's victims were primarily young men, many of whom were encountered in public spaces such as bars, shopping centers, and transit areas. He approached them with offers of money for companionship, photographs, or alcohol. Once inside his apartment, the victims were drugged and restrained. Many were isolated from family or social support networks, making their disappearances less likely to draw immediate attention. The victims had no connection to one another beyond their contact with Dahmer. Their routines and vulnerabilities placed them within reach of a predator, operating without interruption for years. Following the initial discovery, investigators conducted a thorough search of the apartment. Inside, they uncovered human remains stored in containers, preserved body parts, and additional photographs documenting the crimes. A refrigerator and freezer contained human tissue. Chemical containers and tools indicated attempts to preserve remains. Forensic teams documented every item, confirming multiple homicides. The scope of the evidence demonstrated long-term planning and repetition. Each discovery reinforced the conclusion that the crimes were systematic rather than isolated. The investigation expanded rapidly as the scale of the offenses became clear. Jeffrey Dahmer was taken into custody the same day. During questioning, he provided a detailed confession outlining years of killings, beginning in the late 1970s. He described his methods, victim selection, and disposal practices with precision. Investigators corroborated his statements with physical evidence recovered from the apartment and other locations. The consistency between the confession and forensic findings eliminated doubt regarding responsibility. The admissions revealed a pattern of escalating behavior that had continued unchecked for more than a decade. In 1992, Dahmer was found legally sane and convicted of 15 counts of murder. He received 15 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. The case prompted widespread scrutiny of law enforcement failures and missed opportunities for intervention. While incarcerated, Dahmer remained largely isolated. On November 28, 1994, he was killed by another inmate at a Wisconsin correctional facility. His death ended the legal process, but the case continued to influence discussions on investigative oversight and offender detection. Case 4. In 2009, residents on Imperial Avenue in Cleveland repeatedly complained about a powerful foul odor drifting through their neighborhood. City officials attributed the smell to sewage issues or nearby industrial activity. The complaints continued for years, drawing little urgency. Behind the walls of one modest house, a long-running pattern of violence remained hidden. What neighbors believed was neglect or decay was in fact evidence of repeated killings that had gone undetected in plain sight. The case broke open in September 2009 after a woman reported escaping from Anthony Sowell's residence. She stated that she had been assaulted and restrained inside the house, but managed to flee and contact police. Based on her account, officers obtained a search warrant for the property. When they entered the home, they immediately noticed the overwhelming odor that neighbors had described for years. As officers searched the residence and surrounding yard, they began locating human remains. The discovery transformed the report of an assault into a homicide investigation. The evidence at the scene contradicted any explanation of isolated violence. The victims were women from marginalized backgrounds, many struggling with addiction, poverty, or unstable housing. Several had been reported missing, though their cases received limited attention. They were often last seen entering Sowell's home after being offered shelter, food, or alcohol. Their social circumstances made their disappearances less likely to trigger immediate investigations. The victims had no known connection to one another beyond contact with Sowell. Their routines placed them within reach of an offender who relied on invisibility rather than mobility. It would take a survivor's escape to expose the pattern behind their disappearances. As the search continued, investigators discovered bodies throughout the house, basement, crawl spaces, and backyard. Some remains were buried, while others were concealed inside the residence. Forensic teams documented evidence indicating strangulation as the primary cause of death. The scope of the findings confirmed that the killings had occurred over several years. DNA testing and forensic analysis were required to identify several victims due to advanced decomposition. Each discovery reinforced the conclusion that the crimes were methodical and repeated, not spontaneous acts of violence. Anthony Sowell was arrested and charged with multiple counts of aggravated murder, kidnapping, rape, and abuse of a corpse. DNA evidence linked him directly to the victims, and survivor testimony corroborated the pattern of assault and confinement. Prosecutors established that Sowell had a prior conviction for sexual assault, placing him under scrutiny for repeat offenses. The physical evidence recovered from the home supported the accounts of surviving witnesses. When confronted with the evidence, Sowell did not provide a credible explanation for the remains found on his property. In 2011, Sowell was convicted on 82 counts, including 11 counts of aggravated murder. He was sentenced to death by lethal injection. The case prompted widespread criticism of systemic failures, including ignored complaints and inadequate responses to missing persons reports. While on death row, Sowell developed serious health issues. He died in custody in February 2021 before his execution could be carried out. The case remains a stark example of how prolonged neglect allowed repeated killings to continue unnoticed. Case 5. From the 1960s through the early 2000s, dozens of women across the United States were found dead under circumstances that appeared isolated and unrelated. Many cases were ruled accidental, natural, or left unresolved. The deaths occurred in cities large and small, spread across multiple states, with no obvious suspect connecting them. For decades, the pattern remained hidden. Only years later would investigators determine that these scattered cases were linked to a single individual who had moved quietly across the country. The case shifted in the early 2010s when DNA testing in California reopened several unsolved murders from the late 1980s. Evidence recovered from crime scenes was re-examined using modern forensic techniques. The results matched a man already in custody on unrelated charges. Investigators soon realized that the same individual had been present in multiple jurisdictions where similar deaths had occurred. What initially appeared to be separate cold cases began to align. The new forensic evidence contradicted earlier conclusions and suggested homicide rather than accidental death. The victims were primarily women living on the margins of society. Many struggled with homelessness, addiction, or unstable living conditions. Several were involved in sex work or transient lifestyles, which limited consistent contact with family or authorities. Their disappearances often did not trigger immediate investigations. In many cases, their deaths were attributed to overdoses or health issues. The lack of attention allowed the perpetrator to continue operating without detection. The victims shared no personal connection to one another beyond their encounters with the same man in different locations. As investigators revisited older cases, the suspect began providing detailed confessions. He described murders spanning decades, often recalling names, locations, and circumstances with accuracy. He produced drawings of victims from memory, which were later matched to missing persons cases across multiple states. Law enforcement agencies coordinated nationally to verify each claim. Many confessions were supported by independent evidence, including travel records and forensic findings. The scale of the investigation expanded rapidly as connections emerged between cases once believed unrelated. Authorities confirmed that the suspect was responsible for an unprecedented number of murders. Verified admissions linked him to dozens of killings across at least 19 states. The consistency of method and corroborated details led investigators to identify him as the most prolific serial killer in U.S. history. His confessions provided answers to families who had waited decades for resolution. The evidence established a clear pattern of strangulation and disposal designed to avoid detection. The case fundamentally altered national understanding of serial homicide statistics. Samuel Little was convicted in California and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He remained incarcerated while continuing to assist investigators in identifying victims. In December 2020, he died in prison at the age of 80. At the time of his death, efforts to identify additional victims were ongoing. Law enforcement agencies continue to review his confessions and drawings. The case remains open-ended, with many victims still unnamed, and their deaths only recently acknowledged as homicide. Case 6. In November 2022, in the small college town of Moscow, Idaho, 4 university students were found stabbed to death inside an off-campus residence. The home, located near the University of Idaho, showed no signs of forced entry. The victims had been attacked during the early morning hours while inside what was considered a safe and familiar space. News of the killing spread quickly, shattering the sense of security in the community. As details emerged, investigators confirmed that the crime scene suggested a targeted and deliberate act. The investigation began in the early hours of November 13, 2022, when police responded to a report of an unconscious person at the residence. Upon entering the home, officers discovered 4 victims with fatal stab wounds. The coroner later confirmed that the attacks had occurred while the victims were asleep or in their bedrooms. The brutality of the scene prompted immediate involvement from state and federal agencies. The house was secured, evidence was preserved, and the area was canvassed for witnesses. Despite limited initial information, authorities stated that the scene indicated a focused attack rather than random violence. The victims were all university students with active social lives and no known involvement in criminal activity. They were described as maintaining normal routines centered around academics, friendships, and campus events. 2 additional roommates were present in the home that night but were unharmed. Investigators found no evidence suggesting that the victims were engaged in high-risk behavior. Their lack of known enemies or threats complicated early efforts to identify a motive. It would take only days for investigators to determine that the offender had likely studied the residence and its occupants. As the investigation expanded, authorities analyzed forensic evidence collected at the scene. A knife sheath recovered from one of the bedrooms became a central focus. Surveillance footage from nearby cameras captured a white sedan repeatedly circling the neighborhood before and after the estimated time of the murders. Cell phone data revealed that a suspect's device had traveled near the residence multiple times prior to the killings. Digital records established a timeline of movements consistent with premeditation. The combined evidence began to form a clear path toward a single suspect. In December 2022, investigators identified Brian Koberger, a graduate student studying criminology at a nearby university, as the primary suspect. DNA recovered from the knife sheath was matched to Koberger through genealogical analysis. Surveillance footage tracked his vehicle across state lines following the murders. Phone records placed him in the vicinity of the crime scene on multiple occasions. He was arrested at his family's home in Pennsylvania without incident. When confronted with the evidence, prosecutors stated that the forensic and digital trail was extensive and consistent. In 2025, Koberger entered a guilty plea to the murders of all 4 students. The plea agreement resulted in 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. The decision avoided a prolonged trial but generated public debate regarding sentencing. Families of the victims expressed differing views on the outcome. The case prompted discussions about campus safety, digital surveillance, and offender behavior. Koberger remains incarcerated, and the motive behind the killings has not been fully explained, leaving lingering questions for investigators and the public. Case 7. During the 1970s in suburban Chicago, teenage boys and young men began disappearing under circumstances that initially drew little attention. Many were runaways or casually employed laborers, last seen leaving with someone they believed offered work or assistance. As the number of missing persons reports grew, families pressed police for answers. The investigation eventually centered on a quiet residential neighborhood, where evidence would lead officers beneath a seemingly ordinary home and expose one of the most extensive murder cases in American history. The case accelerated in December 1978 with the disappearance of 15-year-old Robert Peast. He was last seen leaving his workplace after speaking with a local contractor about a job opportunity. When Peast failed to return home, his family immediately contacted police. Witness statements placed him in contact with John Wayne Gacy shortly before he vanished. Based on inconsistencies in Gacy's account and prior criminal history, investigators obtained a search warrant for his home. What initially appeared to be a missing person inquiry soon escalated into a homicide investigation when officers detected signs that suggested concealment rather than coincidence. The victims were predominantly teenage boys and young men seeking employment or assistance. Many were drawn in by offers of construction work, transportation, or temporary housing. Their ages and social circumstances made them less likely to be immediately missed by authorities. Several victims had limited family oversight or were attempting to establish independence. Gacy exploited this vulnerability by presenting himself as a stable employee